Chapter 920, Kingdom of Nagaland. The storm raged on as Gaia and Zenali faced off, the howling wind and pouring rain creating a chaotic backdrop for their confrontation. The sky was a tumultuous mixture of dark clouds and flashes of lightning, casting an ominous glow over the battlefield. Gaia's eyes blazed with fury as she faced Zenali, her hands still slick with the blood of her fallen foes. Zenali felt a chill run down her spine as she stared into Gaia's murderous gaze. "Stop this unnecessary killing, Gaia. Norvin and Noah are not here," Zenali pleaded, hoping to reason with her estranged sister. But Gaia's rage burned hot, and she was not about to be swayed by Zenali's words. "So you know where they are," she snarled, tilting her face to the side in a menacing gesture. "I won't tell you," Zenali said firmly, her jaw set. Gaia's eyes narrowed, scanning the battlefield for any sign of her targets. But her attention was soon drawn to the portal on the ground, where a group of people were running toward them. Zenali saw the flicker of recognition in Gaia's eyes and knew that she had to act fast. Before Zenali could react, Gaia swooped down to the ground and snatched a little boy from his mother. The child's screams filled the air as Gaia flew back up into the sky, holding the boy by the throat. "What are you doing?" Zenali shouted in shock, her heart pounding in her chest. Gaia's grip on the child tightened, and Zenali could see the fear in his eyes as he struggled to breathe. The boy's mother screamed from the ground, but her cries were drowned out by the storm. "Tell me where they are, or you can scrape this little boy off the ground," Gaia hissed, her voice filled with malice. Zenali felt a surge of fear wash over her as she gazed up at Gaia, the rain lashing at her face. She knew that Gaia was capable of anything in her current state of mind. But Zenali also knew that she couldn't let her sister win. Taking a deep breath, Zenali gathered her courage and met Gaia's gaze head-on. "I won't give in to your threats, Gaia," she said firmly. "But you should know that the Guardians and Immortals are on their way here. You will pay for what you have done." Gaia's eyes widened slightly at the mention of the Guardians and Immortals, and Zenali could see a flicker of doubt in her expression. But the moment was fleeting, and Gaia's rage soon returned full force. "Then I have nothing to lose," Gaia snarled, tightening her grip on the little boy's throat. Zenali felt her heart race as she watched the scene unfold, the storm raging on around them. She knew that she had to act fast, or else the consequences would be dire. But how could she stop her own sister, who seemed hell-bent on destruction? The sound of thunder echoed through the sky as the two sisters faced off, the fate of the little boy hanging in the balance. The stormy weather seemed to mirror the turbulent emotions of the scene. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the grim determination etched on Gaia's face as she held the innocent boy hostage. Zenali's heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to find the words to appease Gaia's rage. "Stop this madness, Gaia," Zenali pleaded. "There's no need for more bloodshed." But Gaia was beyond reason. Her eyes blazed with fury as she demanded to know the whereabouts of Norvin and Noah. Zenali knew that any answer she gave would be met with violence, and yet she couldn't bear to see an innocent life taken before her eyes. As the little boy dangled helplessly in Gaia's grasp, Zenali felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She had to do something to save him, even if it meant sacrificing her own safety. Gaia's grip tightened, and Zenali's heart skipped a beat. The moment hung in the air, charged with a sense of impending doom. Then, suddenly, Gaia released the boy, sending him tumbling towards the ground. Zenali's heart leaped into her throat as she reached out to catch him, but Gaia caught him first. "Do I look like I'm playing?" Gaia snarled, her eyes glinting with menace. Zenali knew that Gaia was serious. She couldn't afford to hesitate any longer. Gathering her courage, she told Gaia what she wanted to know. The Guardians and Noah were in Nagaland. "They are in Nagaland," as Zenali revealed the location of Norvin and Noah. Gaia's eyes widened in shock for a brief moment. Nagaland was her home kingdom, and the news that her enemies were hiding there caught her off guard. But she quickly regained her composure, and her face twisted into a sinister smile. Nagaland, huh? Gaia said, her voice dripping with malice. Looks like I'll be going back home sooner than I thought. The stormy sky seemed to grow darker as Gaia's words echoed through the air. The wind howled around them, and lightning flashed in the distance as though the very elements were reacting to the evil that Gaia represented. Zenali couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine as she looked at her former sister. Gaia had always been dangerous, but now, with her thirst for revenge fueling her actions, she was downright terrifying. As Gaia turned her gaze in the direction of Nagaland, Zenali felt a sense of dread settle over her. She knew that Gaia was capable of terrible things, and she couldn't imagine what she would do when she reached her home kingdom. But Zenali also knew that she couldn't let Gaia continue on her path of destruction. She had to find a way to stop her, no matter the cost. Gaia's eyes blazed with an intense fury as she turned and flew towards her home kingdom, leaving Zenali to catch the falling boy. Zenali's heart sank as she held the trembling child, watching as his mother rushed to him, embracing him tightly. The stormy sky was a perfect reflection of the turmoil in Zenali's mind. The thought of facing Gaia and her ruthless army, let alone the possibility of the Dark Lord joining them, sent a shiver down her spine. Zenali could only hope that the Council of Immortals would make a quick decision and gather their forces to confront Gaia and her army. But as she looked up at the sky, her heart grew heavy with the realization that the battle to come would be nothing short of catastrophic. The fate of countless lives hung in the balance, and Zenali knew that the only way to end this was to put an end to Gaia's thirst for revenge once and for all. As she took to the air, Zenali couldn't shake off the sickening feeling in her gut. She knew that Gaia's rage would not be easily quenched, and the thought of the Dark Lord joining the fray made her feel even more uneasy. For the first time in a long time, Zenali felt a sense of dread wash over her, and she couldn't help but wonder if they were truly ready to face the darkness that was about to descend upon them. Zenali struggled to keep up with Gaia's swift teleportation, feeling the strain in her muscles with every step she took. Her lungs burned with each breath, but she could not afford to stop. She knew where Gaia was heading and had to reach there before it was too late. The kingdom was a marvel to behold, with towering structures and winding alleys that snaked through the city. The buildings were adorned with intricate carvings of snakes, and the streets were bustling with activity. However, at that moment, the kingdom looked void of people, as Zenali had ordered the evacuation as a precaution. Flying above the kingdom of Nagaland was a sight to behold. The island had a distinct shape, resembling a giant serpent winding through the ocean waves. The buildings were built in such a way that they appeared like scales on the serpent's body. They were mostly made of smooth stones and were curved in shape, giving them a unique, organic feel. The structures were also adorned with intricate carvings of serpents, adding to the overall theme of the kingdom. The island was surrounded by crystal-clear waters, and as Zenali flew over it, she could see schools of brightly colored fish darting through the coral reefs below. The island was also home to dense forests, with trees so tall that their tops seemed to brush against the sky. Mountain ranges dotted the landscape, their peaks covered in snow even during the warmest of seasons. Despite the natural beauty of the island, it was eerily silent. The absence of any signs of life was noticeable, and it was clear that Zenali had made the right choice to evacuate the kingdom as a precaution. Finally, after 3 years, Gaia returned to her home kingdom, soaring high above the island. She took a deep breath, trying to suppress the anger that boiled within her, threatening to spill out like molten lava. As she gazed upon the land that was once her sanctuary, she felt no sense of peace or calm. Instead, her heart was heavy with a thirst for revenge. At last, Gaia's gaze fell upon the castle, her home and the heart of her kingdom. She could see it from miles away, standing proud and tall amidst the greenery and shimmering blue waters of the island. It was the grandest and most elegant castle in the whole world, with its towering turrets, gleaming spires, and intricately designed architecture. Looking at the castle, she could not help but marvel at its grandeur. It stood tall, a magnificent structure made of white stone that shimmered in the sunlight. The castle was built in a style that was unique to Nagaland, with intricate carvings of serpents adorning its walls and pillars. The gates of the castle were made of pure gold and the doors were decorated with precious gems. The castle seemed to be alive with magic, emanating an aura of enchantment and wonder that was impossible to ignore. As Gaia flew closer, she could see the castle's many towers and spires, each one adorned with a different serpent statue. The main tower, which rose high above the others, was made entirely of crystal, and the sunlight that filtered through its walls created a beautiful rainbow of colors. Gaia felt a sense of awe as she realized that this castle was a true masterpiece of Naga architecture. When she got closer to the castle, a jade-green dome suddenly materialized around the entire structure, preventing her from entering. She felt a sharp sting in her hand when she touched the energy dome, indicating that the countermeasures were working effectively. Gaia gritted her teeth in frustration, feeling her anger and thirst for revenge intensify with each passing moment. Soon after, a group of elite soldiers emerged from the castle and surrounded her in the sky. These soldiers were the best of the best, each dressed in the finest armor and weapons that Nagaland had to offer. They were each at the fusion stage, and Gaia sensed that there were a few half-immortals guarding the castle as well. The sight of the soldiers only fueled Gaia's anger further. It was clear to her that Sonali was not taking any chances in order to prevent her from entering the castle. But Gaia was determined to make her way inside, no matter what it took. "You cannot get inside, Gaia." Gaia heard Sonali's voice and turned around. Sonali floated in the air with the royal guards of Nagaland by her side. The guards wore shining armor made of rare metals with intricate designs etched into them. Each guard had a spear in their hand, the tips of which glinted menacingly in the sunlight. They had stern expressions etched into their faces, and their eyes glowed with otherworldly power. Gaia knew that these half-immortal guards were the best of the best and could take on an army single-handedly. Despite standing by Zanala's side, there was a hint of reverence in the guards' eyes when they looked at Gaia. It was impossible to forget that she was once the elder princess of the kingdom, and some still saw her as a symbol of power and authority. However, their respect did not outweigh their fear, as they knew the extent of Gaia's ruthlessness too well. The mere thought of facing her sent shivers down their spines and made their hearts race with fear. Gaia could feel their fear emanating, and it only fueled her anger. Since when does the mighty super guardian need his bitch protecting him? It's usually the other way around. What has changed? Gaia said with a cold, hard edge to her voice. Gaia's eyes flickered with rage as she turned her attention to the royal guards and soldiers surrounding her. Her voice dripped with venom as she spoke. "I won't sully your sense of honor by asking you to step aside. I know you would rather die than let me pass through to the castle to get what I want." Gaia took a step forward, her eyes blazing with fury. "But make no mistake, I will get what I came for, no matter what the cost." The soldiers tensed at her words, their hands hovering over their weapons as they waited for her next move. "All this death and destruction for what, Gaia?" "For a dragon." "When did you become so fond of a dragon?" asked Sonali with a hint of desperation in her voice. "Since you became a bitch to Noah," Gaia snickered, her eyes glinting with anger. "It's unfortunate that history tends to repeat itself," Gaia said with a cold, bitter laugh, her mind flashing back to the memory of burning down an entire prison filled with prisoners 3 years ago. The flames had been so bright and consuming, and the screams of the prisoners had echoed in her mind for months afterward. As Gaia's words echoed in the air, her eyes gleamed with a dangerous glint as she conjured a long bow and a jade arrow. The soldiers tensed and prepared themselves for an imminent battle. Each one of them was several times stronger and more powerful than the Guardians, so Gaia did not take them lightly. The royal guardian quickly floated before Zanali, shielding her with their bodies. They were well aware of the danger that lurked around them, and their eyes flickered with a fierce determination. Zanali stood behind them, her eyes darting back and forth between Gaia and the soldiers. As Gaia pulled the bowstring taut, her eyes locked onto the soldiers, sizing them up with a steely gaze. The tension in the air was palpable, and every breath felt like a weighty burden. With a sudden movement, Gaia released the arrow, and it shot through the air with deadly precision. The soldiers moved quickly, dodging the arrow with an ease that spoke volumes about their skill. They were fast, their movements fluid and precise, and they closed in on Gaia with fierce determination. When the soldiers tried to attack Gaia with their spells, she dodged them with lightning speed. Some soldiers attempted to strike her with their swords and axes, but Gaia parried them with her bow and arrows. Her movements were too quick for the soldiers to keep up, and soon Gaia had taken down several soldiers with her precise shots. The soldiers were relentless, however, and they continued to press forward with their attacks. Gaia was moving with enough speed to leave after images as she aimed and fired with deadly accuracy. The clanging of metal on metal echoed throughout the sky as Gaia's arrows clashed against the soldiers' weapons. Gaia's movements were fluid and precise as she took down the first soldier with a single shot from her jade arrow. The soldier screamed in agony as the arrow pierced his chest, and his body fell to the ground. The remaining soldiers immediately attacked Gaia, casting spells that missed her by a hair's breadth due to her speed and agility. Gaia responded with a rain of arrows that tore through the soldiers' armor, and their blood splattered in all directions. The air was thick with the smell of burning flesh and blood as the soldiers fought fiercely to protect their home. However, Gaia was a formidable opponent, and her accuracy with the bow was unparalleled. She targeted their weak spots, and each shot found its mark, dropping the soldiers one by one. The sound of bones cracking and bodies falling filled the air, and Zenali watched in horror as the soldiers she had trained and fought alongside were mercilessly slaughtered. Zenali watched in horror as Gaia ruthlessly took down each soldier one by one. Despite being outnumbered, Gaia moved with an almost inhuman grace and speed, dodging every attack with ease and unleashing a flurry of deadly arrows. Zenali had never seen Gaia fight with such ferocity and brutality before, and it sent shivers down her spine. She knew that Gaia was fueled by anger and hatred, and there was no stopping her. Zenali felt helpless, and for the first time in a long time, she felt fear creeping into her heart. Chapter 9:21, Battle of Nagaland. As Gaia continued to fight, she drew her bow with unmatched grace and precision. Every arrow that she fired was a masterpiece, imbued with a powerful energy that only the Dark Lord could bestow. Each arrow had a distinct aura and power, ranging from ice, fire, and even poison. As the arrows whizzed through the air, they left a trail of destruction in their wake, striking their targets with deadly accuracy. Zenali watched in horror as the soldiers of Nagaland fell one by one, their bodies tumbling from the sky with a sickening thud. She knew that Gaia was not to be underestimated, but even she was stunned by the level of destruction that Gaia was capable of. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen soldiers. Despite the number of soldiers fighting against her, Gaia continued to fight with a fierce determination, her eyes burning with an intensity that Zenali had never seen before. With each arrow that she fired, she seemed to grow stronger, her power pulsing through the air like a raging inferno. Zenali knew that this battle was far from over and that the fate of Nagaland hung in the balance. Although the soldiers were powerful, they were no match for an immortal stage level 2 warrior. As the last of the soldiers fell from the sky, Gaia's eyes burned with a murderous rage. The two royal guards beside Zenali knew they were no match for her, but they still had a duty to protect their princess. As they prepared to clash with Gaia, Zenali floated before them, shielding them from her sister's wrath. "You still don't understand, do you?" Gaia sneered. Zenali stood firm, refusing to be intimidated. "Stop this, Gaia. You don't have to do this. We can still talk things out." Gaia scoffed at her sister's words. "You still don't get it, do you?" Gaia sneered. "No amount of words will stop me from reaching that monkey and ripping its throat out. This isn't some cheesy drama where a touching speech changes everything. This is real life, and in my world, blood is the only language my enemies understand, and I was just buying time." The innocent, helpless look on Zanalis disappeared and she looked relieved. Gaia turned around to face Sonali, her eyes filled with rage. But as she looked beyond her sister, her expression quickly changed to one of surprise and disbelief. Hundreds of soldiers suddenly appeared between Gaia and the dome around the castle, their armor shining in the sunlight. More soldiers continued to appear out of thin air, their colored armor indicating their affiliation with the Guardian Guild or the Nagaland army. As if that wasn't enough, a massive floating palace emerged above the castle, and flying airships bearing the Guardian Guild symbol appeared in the sky. Gaia couldn't believe her eyes. The backup had arrived and was much bigger than she anticipated. It wasn't just the Guardian Guild but also the Council of Immortals and the Army of Nagaland. The sheer number of soldiers and their impressive appearance were enough to give Gaia pause. The floating palace was a marvel to behold. It was an immense structure made entirely out of white marble, with intricate carvings of serpents and dragons adorning its exterior. It seemed to glow with a gentle radiance, despite the stormy weather. The palace appeared to be surrounded by a golden aura, which pulsed with power and seemed to emanate from the very stones of the building itself. As for the airships, they were impressive machines. Each ship was made of gleaming silver metal, with sharp, angular lines and a streamlined design that made them look like they were flying knives. The sails were emblazoned with the symbol of the Guardian Guild, and they were powered by strange runes that made them glide through the air with ease. Soldiers armed with bows, swords, and other weapons stood ready for battle from the ship's decks. The army that had gathered in the sky was massive, their numbers stretching far beyond what Gaia had expected. As they floated in the air, the sheer size of the force was imposing. The soldiers were clad in shining armor, and their weapons gleamed brightly in the sunlight. The colorful banners of different kingdoms fluttered in the breeze, adding a vibrant contrast to the stark, blue sky. The army of Nagaland itself was impressive in numbers, but now it was multiplied by the forces of the Guardian Guild and the Council of Immortals. Flying airships with the symbol of the Guardian Guild emblazoned on their sails were dotted throughout the sky, adding a technological edge to the otherwise medieval appearance of the army. Gaia stood tall and proud in the face of the overwhelming army that surrounded her in the air. Despite the hundreds of soldiers and the imposing figures that flew out from the floating palace of the Council of Immortals, she showed no signs of fear. Her eyes glinted with a cold determination, her jaw set in a firm line. "If you want to reach Noah, you have to go through this army," Zanala's voice rang out, full of warning. Gaia simply sneered in response, her hand flexing around her bow. She knew that the only way to reach Noah was through the army before her, but she was not afraid. As the army rapidly closed in around her, Gaia braced herself for battle, her eyes scanning the mass of soldiers for any weaknesses or openings. The sheer size and power of the army were daunting, but Gaia was determined to reach her target. She knew that the only way to end this once and for all was to face the army head-on, and she was ready to do whatever it took to achieve that goal. Gaia's eyes blazed with an intense light as she raised her hand toward the sky. Suddenly, the space around her started to distort, sending ripples across the air. The sky began to darken, and thunder rumbled in the distance. A fierce storm appeared out of nowhere, with winds howling and the ocean surrounding Nagaland Island churning violently. The soldiers of Nagaland watched in awe and fear as they witnessed the display of Gaia's power. Even the Council of Immortals, who had seen much in their long lives, were taken aback by the ferocity of the storm that Gaia had conjured. As the wind picked up, Gaia raised her head and said, "You are not the only one with an army." Her words were carried by the wind and echoed across the battlefield. The soldiers of Nagaland braced themselves for the worst, knowing that they were facing a formidable foe. The sky trembled and the air around them grew dense and heavy. Suddenly, a portal ripped open, spilling forth a torrent of hundreds of soldiers completely covered in black armor. Each of them had an eerie aura about them, and their movements were stiff and mechanical. These were not living soldiers, but the Dark Lord's undead army. As they emerged from the portal, they encircled the army that surrounded Gaia. Their sheer size and ominous appearance made them a force to be reckoned with. The soldiers of Nagaland and the Council of Immortals looked on in shock and horror as the army of the undead kept coming out of the portal without slowing down. Unexpectedly, another portal appeared in the sky, and a group of dark-robed figures emerged from it. Their eyes glowed with a haunting intensity, and their skin was deathly pale. As they flew closer, their hissing grew louder, sending chills down the spines of those nearby. It was the vampire army, led by none other than Elder Vampire Saber. The army's sheer size and strength were imposing, and they quickly positioned themselves next to Gaia's army of undead soldiers. Together, the two armies created an unstoppable force, ready to take on anyone who dared to stand in their way. As Zenali and others were staring at the two armies, another portal opened, and through it emerged several imposing figures robed in a unique way. These were the members of the Vampire Death Squad, and their presence alone was enough to make even the bravest of warriors tremble. Leading the charge was Bear, a towering behemoth of a man who wielded two massive axes with ease. He was clad head to toe in black armor, and his eyes glowed with a feral intensity. Next to him was Snake, a wiry figure who moved with a serpentine grace. He wore a hooded cloak that hid his face from view, but the sickly green glow of his eyes was unmistakable. Behind them was the deadly duo of Grey Wolf and White Wolf. The former was a dwarf with a wild mane of hair and a thick beard. He was covered in scars, and his eyes burned with fierce determination. The latter was an elf with striking golden hair and a chiseled jawline. His movements were graceful and fluid, and his eyes held a cold, detached cruelty. Bringing up the rear was Spider, a half-elf woman whose beauty was matched only by her deadly skills. She wore a form-fitting suit of black leather that hugged her curves in all the right places. Her hair was a flowing cascade of blonde waves, and her eyes sparkled with deadly intelligence. Together, the Vampire Death Squad looked like an unstoppable force of nature, and anyone foolish enough to cross them would surely meet a gruesome end. As the Dark Lord's army descended upon them, the army of Zenali grew increasingly fearful. They watched in awe as hundreds of undead warriors, all clad in black armor, emerged from the portal. Some of the soldiers began to back away, unsure of how to react to this sudden appearance. "This can't be happening," one of the soldiers murmured, his voice shaking with fear. "They're the Dark Lord's army," another whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "We can't defeat them." When the soldiers of Zenali's army looked at the Vampire Death Squad and the rest of the Dark Lord's army, fear crept into their hearts. They were afraid, but they were also resolute not to back down easily. One soldier whispered to his comrade, "Have you ever seen such a terrifying army before?" His comrade nodded in agreement. "Not in all my years of service have I seen such a dark and fearsome army." Some soldiers looked at each other, determined to fight until the end. They may have been afraid, but they knew that running away or admitting defeat was not an option. "We will not back down. We will fight until our last breath," a soldier shouted, his voice echoing across the battlefield. When Zenali's army stared in shock at the appearance of the Dark Lord's army, they thought they had seen the worst of it. But then, another portal opened, and out of it emerged a figure that left them breathless. It was a young man in his late teens, wearing a black coat and trousers, and a white shirt. But what was most striking about him were his bat-like wings and his glowing crimson eyes that seemed to pierce through their souls. He had pointed ears that indicated he was a half-elf. The air around them seemed to grow heavier, and many in Zenali's army felt their hearts race with fear. They knew, without a doubt, that this was no ordinary man. They could sense the immense power radiating from him, and it made their breathing difficult. They looked at each other with wide eyes, wondering what kind of creature they were facing. Zenali herself was frozen, staring at the young man in awe and fear. She knew who he was, Azazel, the infamous demon butler of the Dark Lord. She had heard stories of his powers and knew that facing him would be a death sentence for many in her army. As Azazel slowly descended down, He looked around with a cold gaze, sizing up Zanala's army. His wings fluttered gracefully, and he seemed to move with otherworldly grace. The soldiers of Zanala's army felt a chill run down their spines as they watched him. He's Azazel, one of the guardians whispered, his voice shaking with fear. He's the demon butler of the Dark Lord, another added, his voice barely above a whisper. Whispers spread through the ranks, and every soldier felt a shiver down their spine. They had all heard tales of the demon butler Azazel, but no one knew the true extent of his power. All they knew was that his presence alone was enough to make breathing difficult, and many couldn't help but tremble in fear. Chapter 9:22 Battle of Nagaland II. The Council of Immortals had made a grave decision. They had tasked 4 of their own to apprehend Gaia, the Dark Queen. It was a dangerous mission, one that could result in their own demise. Many immortals refused to fight, fearing the wrath of the Dark Lord if they were to interfere. But these 4 were different. They had had enough of the Dark Lord's tyranny and were determined to end it before it even began. They were old, 3 men and 1 woman, but they were powerful beyond measure. Their faces were etched with determination, their eyes burning with a fire that could rival the sun. As the armies in the sky grew in number, the ground below was cast in a shadow. The soldiers of Zanala's army were afraid, but they stood their ground. Just let me in the castle, and all the bloodshed could be avoided, Gaia's voice boomed through the sky, echoing across the battlefield. Her words were dripping with malice and contempt as she stared down at Zanali. The Dark Queen's eyes narrowed in anger as she waited for a response. When none came, she let out a sharp exhale, her frustration evident. To protect one, you are willing to sacrifice hundreds. That is evil in my book. Gaia spat out the words with venom, her tone cold and unforgiving. The silence that followed her statement was deafening. The soldiers on both sides looked on in fear and awe, unsure of what to do next. The 4 immortals slowly descended from the sky, their presence commanding and powerful. Their bodies may have aged, but their powers were as potent as ever. They landed in front of Zanala's army, facing the Dark Lord's army. We will not stand by and watch as the world falls into darkness, the female immortal spoke, her voice steady and unwavering. The 3 male immortals stood beside her, their eyes locked on the Dark Lord's army. We will do whatever it takes to stop you, one of them said. The soldiers of Zanala's army watched in awe as the immortals prepared for battle. Even in their old age, they radiated power and strength. It was clear that they were not to be underestimated. Azazel, Gaia looked up at the demon butler in the air. Take no prisoners. As Gaia gave the order, the tension in the air intensified. Azazel, the demon butler, heard her command and transformed himself into a bolt of lightning with the use of his powerful spell, Lightning Dash. In an instant, he was soaring towards the female immortal, who had been assigned to capture Gaia. Azazel was a fearsome opponent, his strength equal to that of an immortal, thanks to his cultivation being tied to the Dark Lord's own power. He had never experienced the heavenly tribulation like the other immortals, making him a mysterious and dangerous adversary. With the ability to mimic the Dark Lord's spells, Azazel was an invaluable weapon in the Dark Lord's army. As Azazel drew closer, the female immortal braced herself for the attack, knowing she was facing a formidable opponent. The battle had officially begun, and it was clear that hundreds of lives were about to be snuffed out in Nagaland. The 2 armies collided in the air instantly, with Gaia and Azazel facing the immortals. They led the attack like ferocious beasts. The clash of swords and the whizzing of spells filled the air as the 2 armies clashed in a fierce battle. The guardians fought with all their might, casting spells that shook the very foundations of the earth. The sound of thunder echoed in the sky as they summoned lightning bolts to strike the undead army. The guardians also used their weapons, slicing through the undead with swords and axes. Meanwhile, the alpha vampires controlling the undead army showed remarkable coordination and tactical skills. They directed the undead to attack the guardians in waves, using their numbers to their advantage. The undead clawed at the guardians with their rotten hands and gnawed at them with their sharp teeth. They were fearless and relentless, driven by a hunger that knew no bounds. As the battle raged on, it became clear that neither side had a clear advantage. The undead were numerous, but the guardians were powerful and skilled. The guardians continued to cast spells, summoning walls of fire to incinerate the undead and using spells to paralyze them in their tracks. However, the alpha vampires continued to control the undead army with ease, directing them to attack the guardians from different angles. On the other hand, the vampire death squad wreaked havoc like a violent tornado. As the vampire death squad flew into battle, Bear charged forward with his two giant axes, swinging them with tremendous force. His axes met the guardians' weapons, and sparks flew as they clashed. The force of his blows was so powerful that it shattered the guardians' weapons, sending shards of metal flying in all directions. Snake slithered through the air, his thin body making it almost impossible to track his movements. He darted in and out of the guardians' ranks, striking with his venomous blades. With each hit, a deadly toxin entered the guardians' bodies, causing them to writhe in agony and eventually succumb to their injuries. Grey Wolf and White Wolf moved together like a well-oiled machine. Their attacks were swift and precise. Grey Wolf used his small stature to his advantage, sneaking up on unsuspecting guardians and dispatching them quickly and quietly. White Wolf, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of death, her elven grace allowing her to move with lightning speed. She took on multiple guardians at once, her deadly blades cutting through flesh and bone with ease. Spider was the most cunning of them all, using her beauty to lure guardians into her trap. She would flirt and tease, making the guardians believe they had the upper hand, only to strike when they were at their most vulnerable. Her swords and arrows were sharp and deadly, leaving a trail of blood wherever she went. As the vampire death squad fought, their brutality was unmatched. Limbs were severed, heads were chopped off, and blood rained down from the sky. The guardians fought back with all their might, but the vampire death squad was too powerful. The battle was a gruesome dance of death, with each move calculated and deadly. The sky was filled with the screams of the dying and the stench of blood and death. While the vampire death squad was absolutely slaughtering their foes, the vampires were equally as formidable, moving through the air with the grace and speed of a hurricane. Their supernatural abilities made them almost invincible, and they attacked with a brutality that left many soldiers trembling in fear. They tore into their opponents with razor-sharp fangs, draining them of their life force with each bite. Blood spattered across the sky as the battle raged on, with the cries of the dying filling the air. The soldiers of Xenala's army fought bravely, but they were no match for the combined might of the Dark Lord's forces. The undead army swarmed them without mercy, clawing and gnawing at their flesh with a single-minded determination. In the midst of the chaos, the vampire death squad continued to cut a bloody swath through their enemies. Bear's axes cleaved through bone and sinew, while Snake's daggers left a trail of poisoned corpses in his wake. Grey Wolf and White Wolf moved like phantoms, striking without warning and disappearing just as quickly. And Spider's deadly accuracy with her arrows and swords was a sight to behold. It was a gruesome and terrifying battle, with both sides fighting with every ounce of their being. And yet, it seemed as though the Dark Lord's forces were gaining the upper hand. As the battle raged on in the sky, the Guardians had to use their knowledge of magic and their skills in combat to fend off the undead army and the Dark Lord's forces. Some Guardians chanted powerful incantations, conjuring massive spells that illuminated the sky with dazzling lights. The spells ranged from massive fireballs that exploded upon impact, to gusts of wind that could knock down entire rows of the undead army. The Guardians also used their magical abilities to shield themselves and their allies from attacks. The Immortals, in particular, showed the full extent of their power. They floated in the air, radiating an aura of pure energy that left many in awe. They used their knowledge of magic to cast spells of unparalleled magnitude, like a massive beam of light that shot out from the hands of the male Immortal and scorched through the sky, incinerating everything in its path. The female immortals summoned a swirling vortex of energy that sucked in the undead army and shattered them into pieces. Even Zenali, who had been silent for most of the battle, finally drew her sword and joined the fray. She moved with a grace that belied her years, striking down vampires and undead with ease. Her sword glowed with white light as she swung it, sending waves of energy that cut through the dark army like a hot knife through butter. Despite the Guardians' best efforts, however, the Dark Lord's army proved to be a formidable opponent. The Vampire Death Squad continued to take down their foes with brutal efficiency, while the vampires seemed to be unstoppable, using their regenerative abilities and super strength to overpower their enemies. The battle continued to rage on, with no end in sight. Gaia fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, her eyes glowing with a sinister crimson light. She quickly conjured up a storm of dark clouds around her, causing lightning to crackle and rain to pour down on the battlefield. As two immortals charged at her, she aimed her bow and shot a flurry of arrows that split into countless poisonous snakes upon impact. The snakes slithered and coiled around the immortals, biting them with their venomous fangs. As the two immortals were writhing in pain, Gaia chanted an incantation that summoned a massive serpent made of dark energy. The snake coiled around her arm as she aimed it at the sky and released it with a fierce roar. The serpent shot toward the heavens, tearing through the clouds and creating a massive explosion that sent shockwaves throughout the battlefield. Despite the overwhelming power of Gaia's spells, the immortals continued to fight back with their own grandiose magic. One immortal summoned a blinding light that illuminated the entire sky, causing the clouds to part and revealing the stars above. The other immortal created a raging firestorm that incinerated everything in its path. The sky was filled with the clash of spells and the roar of thunder as they continued their battle. The storm around Gaia intensified, the wind howling as lightning struck down all around her. Yet, she continued to fight with unwavering determination, her eyes fixed on her enemies as she unleashed spell after spell. On the other side of the sky, Azazel flew towards the two immortals, determined to use all his arsenal to take them down. A barrage of lightning bolts crackled with deadly electricity, hitting one of the immortals and causing a massive explosion that illuminated the entire sky. Dodging the spells of the other immortal, Azazel unleashed crescent-shaped blades of wind using his wind blast spell. The blades cut through the air like a razor, hitting the second immortal who staggered back with blood oozing from his wounds. Azazel then flew towards the wounded immortal and hit him with all his brute strength. The immortal crashed to the ground with a resounding thud, causing the sky to rumble with the force of the impact. The winds around them intensified, creating a storm of epic proportions. The battlefield was a chaos of spells and weapons as the Guardians and Nagaland soldiers fought with all their might, trying to push back the undead army and the Vampire Death Squad. The outcome was still uncertain, and the storm raged around them, with lightning bolts illuminating the sky and casting eerie shadows on the battlefield. The power coursing through Azazel's veins made him ready for the next attack. He knew that he had to use it to take down the Guardians and the Immortals. The battle was far from over, and he was prepared to fight until the bitter end. As the battle raged in the sky above, the impact of the spells and weapons used by the Guardians and the Dark Lord's army was felt on the ground below. The spells cast by the Immortals and the Guardians were so powerful that they shook the very foundations of the buildings in the kingdom. The sky above the kingdom was lit up by bolts of lightning, and the rumble of thunder was deafening. The impact of the spells sent shockwaves through the air, causing windows to shatter and walls to crumble. The Guardian's spells left scorch marks on the ground, and the undead army left a trail of destruction wherever they went. The ground shook violently, causing buildings to sway and crack. The impact of the battle was felt for miles around, and it was clear that the outcome of this battle would determine the fate of the kingdom. As the battle continued to rage on, the ground shook even more violently, and the buildings in the kingdom began to collapse. The impact of the spells was so great that it felt like an earthquake had struck the kingdom. The Guardians and the Dark Lord's army were so focused on the battle that they paid no attention to the destruction they were causing. It was as if they were fighting in a world of their own, and nothing else mattered except victory. But the consequences of their actions would be felt for years to come. As the sound of battle echoed throughout Nagaland, many rogue cultivators stopped in their tracks, their eyes drawn to the sky. They could see the armies of the Dark Lord and the Guardians of Nagaland fighting in a battle of epic proportions. One rogue cultivator looked up in disbelief. Is this for real? I've never seen such a battle in my life. Another cultivator replied, it seems the rumors were true. The Dark Lord has finally come to claim Nagaland as his own. A third cultivator shook his head. I never thought I'd see the day when the Guardians of Nagaland would have to fight for their lives. This is a dark day indeed. As they watched the battle rage on, the rogue cultivators could see the spells and weapons of both sides causing destruction to the kingdom below. With the war in the sky raged on, the ground shook violently, causing buildings to crumble and roads to split open. The journalists from Royal News and other news agencies watched in horror from a safe distance, their cameras rolling to capture every moment of the carnage. One of the reporters from Royal News, a young woman named Sarah, felt her heart pounding in her chest as she watched the battle unfold before her eyes. This is insane, she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. I never imagined it would be like this. Another journalist, a seasoned veteran named John, could barely contain his shock as he watched the undead army swarm toward the Guardians and Nagaland soldiers. This is worse than anything I've ever seen, he muttered, his eyes wide with disbelief. I can't believe they're actually fighting in the sky like this. It's like something out of a nightmare. As the battle raged on, the reporters could feel the raw power of the spells and the thunderous roar of the clashes. The fear and desperation of the soldiers were palpable, and the reporters could barely process the magnitude of the destruction around them. This is madness, Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. How can anyone survive this? How can anyone even hope to win? John shook his head, his face grim. I don't know, he said. All I know is that this is a battle unlike any other. And we're witnessing it firsthand. This is the first time I had written such a massive scale war scene. So please forgive me if there are mistakes. I will strive to write better in the future. Chapter 923, Battle of Nagaland 3. The sky was alive with chaos and bloodshed as vampires and cultivators clashed in a large-scale battle. From the sky, they brought the war down to the ground, bringing destruction with them. Spells were fired left and right, reducing buildings to rubble and turning the once thriving streets into a war zone. The undead, with their rotting flesh and cold eyes, fought alongside the Nagaland soldiers on the ground, their flesh tearing with every blow they took. Undead to the barrier, as Azazel fought ferociously against the Immortals, the Dark Queen barked an order at her partner in crime. Azazel, with his twisted grin, understood her perfectly, commanding the Alpha Undead to send a battalion of undead to the energy dome surrounding the castle. The undead, with their decayed bodies and rusted weapons, rushed toward the energy dome, their eyes gleaming with bloodlust. The energy dome sparked and burned as the undead threw themselves at it, trying to break through. Their skin sizzled, and their limbs charred as they pushed their way through, their screams of agony ringing out like a twisted melody. But their overwhelming numbers proved to be too much, causing the energy dome to ripple and flicker under their relentless assault. The battle was a gruesome affair, with bodies littering the ground and blood staining the streets. Severed limbs and entrails were scattered among the rubble, a macabre display of the brutality of war. The vampires and cultivators fought with ruthless determination, their eyes glowing with an insatiable hunger for victory. But the undead were just as fierce, fighting with a single-minded focus that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. They clawed and bit at their enemies, their rotting teeth sinking into flesh and their decaying hands tearing at clothing and armor. The stench of death and decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the acrid scent of magic. Amidst the chaos, Gaia and Azazel fought on, their power crackling and sparking with every spell they cast. The sky was awash with colors, with red and blue magic clashing in a deadly dance. They fought with a ferocity that was unmatched, their eyes glowing with a fierce determination to emerge victorious from this bloody conflict. The battle raged on, and as the sun began to set, it was clear that neither side was willing to back down. The undead continued their assault on the energy dome, their numbers dwindling with every passing minute. The Nagaland soldiers fought with a determination born of desperation, their weapons stained with the blood of their fallen comrades. Roalfa di Alpha Zanala's eyes widened in horror as she watched the undead hurling themselves at the energy barrier, their undead bodies bursting into flames upon contact. The stench of burning flesh and hair filled the air, mingling with the acrid smell of magic. Amidst the chaos, Gaia flew down from the sky while evading the spells cast by the Immortals as she swooped toward a bloated undead. The bloated undead was a grotesque experiment of Dalar's, filled with noxious gases that could cause a massive explosion upon impact. Gaia's fingers dug into the rotting flesh of the undead, ignoring the putrid smell as she hurled it toward the two Immortals hot on her heels. The bloated undead flew between two buildings, exploding in a shower of gore and viscera. Blood, flesh, and bone rained down on the Immortals as they frantically cast protective spells to shield themselves from the blast. The explosion was deafening, shattering the windows of nearby buildings and causing the ground to shake violently. The deafening roar of the explosion echoed through the war-torn streets, sending shivers down the spines of everyone who heard it. The two towering Immortals, now unprotected, found themselves under a rain of deadly arrows, each piercing through their thick skin with a sickening thud. They struggled to fend off the barrage of arrows while simultaneously trying to avoid the falling debris of the shattered buildings. The Alpha undead seized the opportunity and signaled the horde to attack the vulnerable Immortals. The undead swarmed around them, clawing and biting, their ravenous hunger for flesh apparent in their frenzied attacks. The Immortals may have had bodies like steel, but the undead's relentless bites still caused them excruciating pain. As the chaos unfolded, Gaia's face contorted into a wicked grin as she charged toward the female Immortal, her canines morphing into venomous fangs resembling those of a cobra. With a vicious lunge, she sank her fangs into the Immortal's neck, injecting her lethal venom. The female Immortal shrieked in agony, clawing at her neck as the poison spread through her body. Meanwhile, the male Immortal, blinded by the jade mist sprayed by Gaia, writhed in agony, his eyes burning like hot coals. He tried to fend off the undead, but they were too many, tearing at his clothes and scratching his skin. Gaia, seeing the opportunity, summoned a crimson-red blade and lunged at the Immortals with lightning speed, striking them with savage blows. Blood spattered everywhere as her blade found its mark again and again, slicing through flesh and bone. The scene was a gruesome display of carnage and brutality, with limbs and body parts strewn everywhere and the stench of blood and death permeating the air. Gaia's eyes glimmered with satisfaction as the two Immortals finally met their demise at the end of her crimson blade. The undead eagerly descended upon the Immortals' lifeless bodies, tearing them apart with their razor-sharp teeth and claws. But Gaia had no time to revel in her victory, for her attention was quickly drawn to Azazel, who was engaged in a brutal battle against the other two Immortals. As she approached the chaotic scene, Gaia watched in awe as Azazel unleashed his full power. Dark lightning bolts crackled from his fingertips, illuminating the dark sky with a menacing glow. He dodged and weaved around the Immortal spells, his wings flapping with ferocity. With each strike of his magic, the ground shook and trembled, causing debris to rain down upon the hapless guardians and Nagaland soldiers below. In the midst of the chaotic battle, Azazel was a force to be reckoned with. With his wings flapping furiously, he unleashed bolts of dark lightning at the two Immortals who were struggling to keep up with his speed and power. His eyes were filled with a wild glint, and his lips curled into a devilish grin as he relished in the mayhem and destruction he was causing. As Azazel flew around the sky, his spells caused buildings to crumble and explode, raining down debris on the Nagaland soldiers and guardians below. He swooped down to attack the soldiers with his bare hands, tearing them apart with savage strength and merciless precision. Blood spattered across his face as he ripped through their flesh and bones with ease, leaving nothing but mangled corpses in his wake. The Guardians, horrified by Azazel's brutality, tried to defend themselves with their weapons and spells. But their efforts were in vain, as Azazel's power and ferocity proved too much for them to handle. He lunged at them, snarling like a wild animal, and tore them apart one by one. Despite facing two immortals at the same time, Azazel never once faltered. Instead, he seemed to revel in the challenge, laughing maniacally as he dodged their spells and launched his own attacks. The air crackled with dark energy as he unleashed a barrage of spells at them, his wings beating fiercely to keep him aloft. And as he continued to wreak havoc on the battlefield, the ground below him was littered with the broken and lifeless bodies of his enemies. As Azazel continued to fight the two immortals, Gaia joined the fray and made a formidable team together. Gaia flew around the immortals, spewing a thick jade-green poison mist from her mouth. The mist hung heavily in the air, almost suffocating the immortals. With lightning-fast reflexes, Azazel fired a crackling bolt of lightning into the mist, causing a great explosion that sent the two immortals hurtling through the air. Gaia wasted no time and flew toward one of the immortals, stabbing him in the back repeatedly with her crimson-red blade. The other immortal tried to cast a spell, but before he could even finish the incantation, Azazel placed his palm on the immortal's face and fired a lightning bolt out of his hand, piercing through the immortal's eyes. The immortal screamed in pain as Gaia threw her blood-soaked blade at Azazel. Azazel caught the blade mid-air, and without hesitation, he sliced off the head of the other immortal with a swift motion. The decapitated head rolled on the ground, leaving a trail of blood behind. Azazel then threw the blade back to Gaia, who easily caught it. She continued to stab the remaining immortal in front of her, her eyes fixated on Zenali. The scene was brutal and gory, with blood and body parts littering the battlefield. The stench of death hung heavily in the air, making breathing almost unbearable. The combination of Gaia's poison mist and Azazel's lightning bolts made for a deadly combination, leaving the immortals with no chance of survival. It was a true display of power and skill, and the spectators who witnessed the battle were left in awe and terror. With the four immortals dead and their bodies being devoured by the undead, Azazel and Gaia turned their bloodied gazes towards the rest of the Guardians and Nagaland army. Just as Gaia and Azazel killed the immortals, more airships appeared in the horizon, ready to engage in battle. "Destroy them all," Gaia ordered Azazel, pointing at the Guardian airships. Her voice was cold and filled with venom, reflecting her determination to win this battle. Azazel's grin grew wider as he acknowledged the order and soared towards the airships with his dark wings. Gaia's robes were soaked with blood and her once lustrous raven hair was now matted with the blood of her enemies. In that moment, she looked like a goddess of war, ready to annihilate anyone who dared cross her. As Azazel departed to destroy the Guardian ships, Zenali swiftly sliced off a vampire's head, her eyes locking with her sister's. It was time for the final showdown between the two sisters, who had been at odds for so long. The tension between the two sisters was palpable as they floated in the air, circling each other like birds of prey. Despite her training, Zenali knew that she was outmatched by Gaia's immense power and skill. In a last-ditch effort, she reached into her space ring and retrieved the most precious artifact of Nagaland, an emerald cube. As soon as the cube appeared in her hand, Gaia's eyes narrowed with recognition. She knew the power of the artifact. It was the most formidable weapon in Nagaland's arsenal, one that hadn't been used in centuries. Zenali didn't hesitate. She crushed the cube in her hand, and it shattered into millions of tiny specks of green light that enveloped her. The specks of light danced around Zenali, forming a complex pattern in the air before coalescing into a grand armor. The armor was made of a vibrant green metal that shone like an emerald in the sunlight, with intricate patterns etched into the surface. It covered Zenali from head to toe, leaving only her eyes visible behind a glowing visor. The armor hummed with power, and Zenali could feel the energy coursing through her body, invigorating her with strength and speed. The armor was not only beautiful but also incredibly functional. It was lightweight and flexible, allowing Zenali to move with ease, yet strong enough to withstand even the strongest attacks. Two metal wings sprouted from Xenala's back, resembling a pair of dragonfly wings. They were made of the same emerald green metal as the armor, with sharp edges that looked like they could cut through steel. The mere sight of the armor made Gaia's eyes widen in surprise, for she knew that it was the most powerful artifact of the Nagaland treachery. The armor's main purpose was not to enhance the wearer's cultivation but to withstand an immortal's attacks. The metal used to forge it and the runes etched into it rendered the armor nearly indestructible, giving Xenali a fighting chance against Gaia. As Xenali hovered in mid-air, the armor hummed with energy, and her cultivation stage surged, reaching the half-immortal level. She clenched her fists, ready to face her sister in battle, while the metal wings on her back unfurled with a deafening metallic roar. Chapter 924 Battle between the sisters. As Xenali felt the power of the Nagaland artifact surging through her veins, she focused her will and channeled it into the runes etched onto her armor. A blinding flash of emerald light erupted from the armor, and a long sword materialized in Xenala's hand. The sword was crafted from a rare, deep green metal that seemed to radiate an otherworldly power. The hilt was decorated with snake patterns that seemed to writhe and move in the light, while the blade glimmered with an eerie emerald sheen. Gaia knew exactly what it was, the Sword of Nagaland, a weapon meant for only the reigning queen of Nagaland. Her fury grew as she realized that Xenali, a mere princess, had been granted such a powerful artifact by her father's foolishness. Gaia's eyes narrowed as she prepared to face Xenali and the Sword of Nagaland. Xenala's eyes blazed with determination as she dashed towards Gaia, her metal wings propelling her forward with incredible speed. The sound of her sword cutting through the air was like a siren, warning Gaia of the imminent danger. Gaia raised her crimson-red sword in anticipation, ready to meet Xenala's attack head-on. The two swords clashed with a deafening sound, sending shockwaves through the air and causing cracks to form in nearby buildings. The force of the impact was so great that it made the ground shake beneath their feet. The sparks flew as the two swords continued to collide with each other, each woman determined to prove her superiority over the other. The clash between Gaia and Xenali intensified as sparks flew from their swords, illuminating the night sky. Gaia's crimson-red sword glinted menacingly as she twirled it effortlessly in her hand while her other hand gripped the bow with expert precision. The onlookers gasped in awe as they watched Gaia wield both weapons with deadly accuracy. Gaia's movements were swift and fluid as she blocked Xenala's attacks with her sword and simultaneously launched a barrage of arrows at her opponent. The arrows moved with a life of their own, guided by Gaia's energy as they homed in on Xenali. Xenali, however, was not easily defeated. She expertly deflected Gaia's arrows with her sword and closed in on Gaia with lightning-fast movements. The two clashed once again, their swords ringing out as they struck against each other. Gaia's swordplay was as fluid and graceful as a dancer's movements. She expertly deflected Xenala's sword strikes with her own crimson-red sword, which glinted dangerously in the sky. Even with the added weight of the bow in her other hand, Gaia showed no signs of slowing down or faltering. In a split second, Gaia switched from deflecting Xenala's sword to raising her bow and firing off arrows through the use of her energy. Her movements were so smooth and swift that it seemed like the sword and bow were natural extensions of her body. With each arrow she fired, Gaia used her energy to guide its trajectory, making sure it hit its intended target with deadly precision. The arrows flew through the air like streaks of light, whistling past Xenali and forcing her to dodge and weave. But despite the relentless barrage of arrows, Xenali remained determined and focused, her eyes locked on Gaia as she continued to press the attack. The sound of metal clashing and arrows whizzing through the air echoed through the battlefield as the two women engaged in a fierce and deadly dance of blades and arrows. As the battle between Gaia and Xenali raged on, the sky above them grew even more ominous as if reflecting the violent conflict unfolding below. The clouds turned a deep shade of gray, thunder roared in the distance, and lightning lit up the sky in bright flashes. The storm raged on, the winds howling like the cries of the dying. The rain was coming down in sheets, drenching the two sisters as they fought in the air. The raindrops were heavy and cold, making it harder for them to fly, but they continued to clash swords and arrows amidst the downpour. The storm was a fitting backdrop for the fierce battle that was tearing apart the castle, the flashes of lightning illuminating the destruction and adding to the drama of the fight. The sky above was covered with dark and ominous clouds as flashes of lightning lit up the battlefield below. Zenali and Gaia were suspended in the air, locked in a deadly dance with their swords. The clash of metal echoed throughout the ruined city, adding to the chaos and destruction that surrounded them. Gaia's eyes burned with fury as she glared at Zenali, her crimson-red sword poised to strike. Zenali's emerald sword glowed with an otherworldly light, and her metal wings shimmered in the stormy sky. "Look around you," Gaia spat, her voice barely audible over the howling winds. "All this death and destruction is because you didn't let me through the barrier. You could have saved them, Zenali. But you chose to protect that coward instead." Zenali's expression hardened, and she lunged forward, sword aimed at Gaia's chest. The two swords clashed once more, the impact sending shockwaves throughout the air. The energy emanating from their weapons illuminated the dark sky, casting an eerie glow over the carnage below. Gaia attacked Zenali with her sword and a barrage of arrows at the same time, the sound of metal clashing with metal and the whistling of arrows filling the air. But Zenali's armor was able to withstand Gaia's attacks, protecting her from any fatal wounds. Without the armor, Zenali would have been struck down by Gaia's relentless assault. Despite the power of the armor, it was clear that Gaia had the upper hand in the battle. Her attacks were swift and precise, and her control over the arrows was impressive. Zenali was barely holding her own, parrying Gaia's sword strikes and dodging the arrows with all her might. The stormy sky grew darker as they continued to fight, and thunder rumbled in the distance. The wind picked up, making it difficult for the two sisters to maintain their balance in the air. But they pushed on, their determination to defeat the other never wavering. Gaia's eyes blazed with fury as she spoke, her sword locked in a fierce clash with Zenali's. "You are making a grave mistake by standing in my way, Zenali," she spat out through gritted teeth. "If he comes here, you won't have anything left to rule." Her words hung heavy in the air as Zenali braced herself for the next wave of attacks. The dark storm raged on, lightning illuminating the sky with flashes of blinding light. With a sudden surge of energy, Gaia broke away from the clash and leaped backward, drawing her bow with a swift motion. Zenali's eyes widened as she saw the barrage of arrows hurtling toward her at breakneck speed. She brought up her sword to deflect them, but Gaia was not done yet. With a flick of her wrist, Gaia unleashed a series of powerful energy blasts that streaked toward Zenali, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. But Zenali was not defenseless. The armor Castienne had gifted her glowed with a bright green light as it absorbed the brunt of the attacks. Zenali felt the shock waves reverberate through her body, but she stood firm. Without the armor, she would have been no match for Gaia's onslaught. Zenali gritted her teeth as she clashed swords with Gaia in the midst of a fierce storm. "We will stop you and the Dark Lord," she declared, determination etched on her face. Suddenly, Zenali surged forward, delivering a powerful punch with the hilt of her sword that landed squarely on Gaia's face. Blood sprayed from Gaia's mouth, but instead of faltering, she cackled maniacally, revealing blood-stained teeth. In response, Gaia conjured a giant arrow with a wave of her hand and let it fly at Zenali, causing a deafening explosion that sent Zenali hurtling into the air. Despite their injuries and the bloodshed, the two sisters fought on with unyielding ferocity, refusing to back down. As the battle intensified, Gaia and Zenali began to cast spells at each other. Gaia chanted a spell and summoned a giant serpent made of black poisonous mist. The serpent lunged at Zenali, who responded by casting a spell of her own. She conjured a wave of green poison that took the form of a giant cobra, and the two serpents clashed in the air. The clash created a massive shockwave that shook the ground and sent debris flying in all directions. The sky turned a sickly green hue as if the clouds were made of poison. Gaia's serpent lashed out with its tail, but Sinala's cobra dodged and countered by sinking its fangs into the serpent's body. Gaia responded by unleashing a barrage of poison-tipped arrows, but Sinali used her sword to deflect them. The arrows hit the ground and caused small explosions, leaving behind craters of poisoned earth. Sinali retaliated with a spell that summoned a swarm of smaller serpents made of green mist. The serpents slithered toward Gaia, but she used her bow to shoot them down one by one. The battle between the two sisters raged on, and the sky and the ground continued to bear the scars of their magical combat. The Nagaland soldiers and guardians below watched in awe and horror as the two Nagas fought with all their might. The battle between Gaia and Zanali continued with ferocity as they unleashed a barrage of spells and attacks on each other. The sky turned dark as clouds of green and crimson poison hung in the air, causing anyone who breathed it to choke and cough uncontrollably. Gaia conjured a massive serpent made of green poison that slithered towards Zanali, its fangs dripping with deadly venom. Zanali responded by summoning a swarm of smaller serpents made of crimson poison that swarmed around Gaia, biting and tearing at her skin. Gaia retaliated by calling forth a gust of wind that sent Zanali flying backward, crashing into the ground with a sickening thud. Zanali quickly got back on her feet and unleashed a flurry of punches and kicks, each one fueled by the strength of the emerald armor. Gaia parried each blow with her sword and countered with her own attacks, striking Zanali with swift and precise strikes that left bloody gashes on her skin. Zanali gritted her teeth and fought back with renewed vigor, her attacks growing more brutal and savage with each passing moment. The two Nagas fought with such intensity that the ground beneath them began to crack and split, and the sky above them split open with flashes of lightning and thunder. As they continued to fight, the air around them grew thick with the stench of blood and poison, and the ground beneath them was soaked in a mixture of blood and poison. Despite the exhaustion and injuries, neither of them gave an inch, each determined to emerge victorious. The battle raged on, with no end in sight as both Gaia and Zanali fought with all their might, their bodies battered and broken, but their spirits unbroken. The only thing that could be heard was the sound of metal clashing against metal and the grunts of pain as each blow landed. Finally, with a scream of fury, they launched themselves at each other, their weapons meeting in a shower of sparks. And with that, the battle between the two sisters continued, with no end in sight. Stop! Suddenly, a dominant voice echoed through the sky as Gaia and Zanali both froze in their tracks. The voice was familiar yet commanding, and it was enough to halt their violent clash. Zanali looked relieved, while Gaia's fists clenched in anger. Slowly turning around, Gaia saw Castiel, Zanala's father, standing tall and proud in his regal attire. Despite the tension in the air, Castiel exuded an air of calm authority. He was neither too thin nor muscular, and his green hair was neatly styled. His beard was stubble, and his eyes resembled those of a snake, befitting his status as the king of Nagaland. Gaia's heart raced as she faced the man who she thought of as her father until she learned the truth. She couldn't shake off the realization that he was not her real father. Nevertheless, she tried to hide her inner turmoil and stood her ground as Castiel approached them. Castiel was dressed in regal robes of emerald green, adorned with golden threads and intricate snake patterns. The robes fluttered in the wind, billowing out behind him like the wings of a mighty serpent. Enough, Castiel said, his voice firm yet gentle. I won't have my daughters fighting each other. As Castiel's voice echoed through the sky, the battle below continued to rage on. The thundering clash of swords, the whistling of arrows, and the roar of magic spells filled the air, creating a deafening chaos. The ground trembled under the feet of the fighters, and the dark clouds above seemed to reflect the darkness and despair of the situation. Amidst all the chaos, only Gaia and Zanali stopped fighting, both still hovering in mid-air, their eyes locked on each other. The tension between them was palpable, and it seemed as if the slightest movement from either of them could trigger a renewed attack. Around them, the battle continued to rage on, with the Guardians and Nagaland soldiers fighting desperately against the undead and vampires. Blood flowed freely on the ground, and the stench of death filled the air. Despite Castian's sudden appearance, the fighting continued, for everyone knew that even a momentary distraction could cost them their lives. The Guardians and Nagaland soldiers fought with renewed vigor, their determination to protect their kingdom and people shining through in their every move. In the midst of all this, Gaia and Zenali remained locked in a tense standoff, their swords at the ready. The air between them crackled with energy, and it seemed as if the slightest misstep could trigger a deadly attack. As soon as Gaia heard Castian's voice, her heart sank. She had not seen her father for 3 years, ever since he disowned her and broke her meridians. At first, she was shocked to see him on the battlefield, but then anger filled her heart. How dare he show up here after what he had done to her? Castian, on the other hand, felt a mix of emotions when he saw Gaia. He was surprised to see her fighting on the battlefield, and it had been 3 years since he had last seen her. However, he could see the rage in her eyes, and he knew that she was still angry with him. Gaia watched her father approach, her fists clenched. She felt a mix of emotions, from anger to sadness to betrayal. She wanted to scream at him, to demand an explanation for what he had done to her. But she held herself back, not wanting to show any weakness in front of him. Castian stopped in front of Gaia, looking down at her with a mix of regret and sorrow. "Gaia, my daughter," he said softly. "I never meant to hurt you." Gaia snorted, her eyes flashing with anger. "You disowned me, Castian," she spat. "You broke my meridians and threw me out of my own castle. How could you say that you never meant to hurt me?" Gaia felt a pang of sadness in her heart. She had always longed for her father's love, but now that he was standing in front of her, she didn't know what to do. Looking at Gaia, Castian's emotions were a mixture of surprise, shock, and concern. "Gaia, stop this madness. You have fallen to the dark side. Listen to your father." Gaia glared at him with anger and said, "Father." She snickered, "You betrayed me and threw me out of my own castle. You chose Zenali over me for Celici and her offspring." Castian's expression turned sad, but he still defended his actions. "I did what I thought was best for Nagaland. Zenali is a capable leader, and I love her and Celici." Gaia scoffed at his response and retorted, "Love? You call what you did to me and our kingdom love? You broke my meridians and threw me in prison while selling off our assets to feed the prisoners. You are no king. You are a coward." Castian looked pained by her words, but he still stood his ground. "I stand by my decisions, Gaia. I will always love you, but I won't apologize for doing what I thought was right for our people." Gaia snarled at him and raised her sword. "I don't give a fuck about you or your love anymore. All I care about is that monkey and Noah hiding inside the castle, and I won't let anyone, not even you or Zenali, stand in my way." With that, Gaia lunged at Castian, ready to strike him down. But before she could make contact, Zenali intercepted her, and they resumed their battle in the sky. Castian watched them, his expression heavy with regret and sadness, as he realized the deep rift that had formed between him and his daughter. Chapter 925, Holy Maiden's appearance. As the battle raged on between Gaia, Zenali, and the Guardians, Azazel found himself single-handedly fighting off the Guardian airships. His strength seemed to grow with each passing minute, and he couldn't help but think about the Dark Lord. His mind was consumed with the thought that wherever the Dark Lord was, he was growing in power, and this power was somehow being transferred to Azazel. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the clash of metal as Azazel single-handedly took on the Guardian airships. His muscles bulged and rippled under his skin as his strength grew by the minute, fueled by his connection to the Dark Lord. He couldn't help but revel in the feeling of power coursing through his veins, knowing that the Dark Lord was behind it all. The Guardians, flying out of their airships, attempted to stop Azazel with all their might, but they were no match for his raw strength and formidable spellcasting abilities. Their best fighters were only at the fusion stage, while Azazel had already reached level 8 of the Immortal stage, making him an unstoppable force. With a flick of his wrist, Azazel sent a barrage of lightning bolts raining down upon the airships, causing them to explode into fiery debris. His eyes glinted with an otherworldly light as he launched himself at the Guardians, his movements quick and fluid like a serpent. One by one, he eliminated them with a flurry of blows and devastating spells. Azazel charged toward the group of fusion stage Guardians, a devilish grin spreading across his face. He relished the thought of taking down such powerful opponents, their blood spilling onto his hands. The Guardians tried to attack him with their swords, but Azazel easily evaded their attacks with his agility and brute strength. His demonic powers surged within him, causing the air around him to crackle with dark energy. Azazel raised his hand and fired a powerful gust of wind, sending the Guardians flying back. He then charged towards them, swinging his fists and delivering crushing blows that shattered bones and ripped apart flesh. The Guardians screamed in agony as Azazel's attacks grew more and more brutal. Blood spurted out from their wounds, painting the air red. As the last of the Guardians fell to the ground, Azazel turned his attention toward the airship. He leaped into the air and landed on the ship's deck with a loud thud. The ship's crew tried to attack him with their weapons, but Azazel easily swatted them aside with his massive strength. With a wicked grin, Azazel summoned a massive ball of lightning and hurled it toward the ship's engines. The energy exploded upon impact, causing the ship to shake violently before exploding into a massive ball of fire. The sky turned into a fiery inferno, with debris raining down upon the ground below. The debris from the explosion rained down upon the battlefield, causing chaos and destruction. The debris hit both the undead and the Nagaland soldiers, causing them to fall to the ground in pain. The battle continued despite the debris raining down upon them, with both sides fighting tooth and nail for victory. Azazel looked down upon the chaos with a sense of satisfaction. He had struck a mighty blow against the Guardians, and he relished the thought of causing even more destruction. He raised his fists to the sky, letting out a howl of triumph as the battle raged on around him. The Guardians in the next airship witnessed Azazel's brutal attack on their comrades and the destruction of their airship as they were filled with fear and desperation. One of the Guardians shouted, "We need to take him down. He's too dangerous to be left alive." Another Guardian replied, "But how? He's too strong for us to handle. By the gods, what kind of monster is he?" Another Guardian, his voice trembling, replied, "I don't know, but we need to stop him before he destroys us too." While they continued to panic and discuss their options, Azazel noticed their airship and made his way toward it, ready to take on his next opponent. "We have to stop it," a third Guardian said, determination in his voice. "We can't let it destroy any more of our ships." But despite their bravado, the Guardians couldn't help feeling a sense of dread as they saw Azazel effortlessly take down the airship before them. The sheer power and ferocity he displayed were unlike anything they had ever seen before. "We have to use all our strength," the third Guardian said, his voice strained as he channeled his energy. "We can't let this monster defeat us." As the airship drew closer, the Guardians prepared to face off against Azazel, knowing that their lives were on the line. They couldn't afford to make any mistakes, but even with all their training and preparation, they knew that they might not be able to defeat this powerful foe. Explosive flashes of light lit up the sky as the Guardians fired their cannons at Azazel. Despite the incoming attack, Azazel charged forward, fearless, and sliced through the cannons with ease, his demonic aura growing hotter by the moment. Spells from the Guardians flew toward him, but Azazel blocked them with brute strength, sending them back toward the ship. With a loud roar, he leaped into the air and landed on the ship's deck. The Guardians tried to defend themselves with weapons, but it was too late. Moving like a blur, fueled by his demonic energy, Azazel tore through the Guardians' flesh with claws and fangs, ripping them apart in a shower of blood and gore. The deck of the ship was soon covered in a thick layer of crimson, and the screams of the dying Guardians echoed through the air. Azazel showed no mercy, ripping apart each Guardian with a ferocity that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring. The sound of metal scraping against metal, mixed with the cries of the dying guardians, filled the air. One of the guardians, who had managed to stay hidden, attempted to cast a spell. Azazel sensed him quickly and turned around, his eyes burning with demonic fire. He grabbed the guardian by the neck and lifted him off the ground. Eggless novel com, puny scum, Azazel growled, tightening his grip around the guardian's neck. The guardian choked, unable to speak or move. Azazel's eyes glowed with demonic power, and the guardian's body started to burn from the inside out. Screaming in agony, the guardian was thrown into the air, and with a swift movement of Azazel's hand, he fired a bolt of lightning that incinerated the guardian into ashes. The airship erupted in a massive explosion, and debris rained down on the battlefield below. The explosion sent shockwaves through the battlefield, causing many of the soldiers and undead to lose their footing. Unfazed by the blast, Azazel's demonic aura grew even stronger. He looked up at the sky, a fierce grin on his face, daring anyone to come at him. Azazel moved with supernatural speed and agility, leaping from one guardian airship to another, leaving a trail of destruction in his wake. The sound of the guardians' cannons echoed through the sky as they fired relentlessly at him, but Azazel dodged them effortlessly. With each ship he destroyed, the sky was lit up with fiery explosions and the sound of metal being ripped apart. The debris from the airships rained down on the battlefield, causing chaos among the soldiers and undead on the ground. The guardians on board the airships tried to defend themselves, but their efforts were in vain. As Azazel descended upon them, they spoke in panicked tones, their words cut short by the sound of his brutal attacks. "Stop him. He's too powerful. We can't." The guardians' screams were drowned out by the sound of their bodies being torn apart by Azazel's claws and fangs. His demonic aura burned brighter with each kill, and he reveled in the fear and chaos he caused. While Azazel was wreaking havoc in the air, he suddenly felt the temperature plummet. The sudden drop in temperature caught Azazel off guard. Snowflakes, growing larger by the second, began to fall from the sky, obstructing his vision. Azazel paused in mid-air, his demonic aura blazing hot against the chilling coldness that enveloped him. Through the snow, Azazel's eyes widened in shock at the sight of a massive floating palace descending from the dark clouds above. The palace, carved entirely from ice, glinted in the strange light of the snowfall. The frigid aura emanating from the palace penetrated deep into his bones, sending shivers down his spine. A thick mist surrounded the palace, and as it floated down towards the battlefield, the mist spread out like tendrils, covering everything in a thick layer of frost. The soldiers and undead below shivered, their movements slowed by the intense cold. The palace floated down towards Azazel, and he could sense an incredible power emanating from it. It was a power he had never felt before, and it filled him with awe and fear. As the palace hovered above the battlefield, the mist dissipated, revealing its full glory. The towering palace was adorned with intricate carvings of ice and snowflakes, and the windows glowed with an otherworldly light. The frigid air around the palace seemed to drain the warmth from everything, and Azazel's breath fogged up in front of him. His fingers and toes grew numb, and he felt like he was freezing from the inside out. As the ice mist slowly cleared, a figure flew out toward Azazel. At first, he couldn't make out who it was, but as she drew closer, he saw that it was Rowena Winston. Azazel's eyes widened in surprise. Rowena Winston was a sight to behold. Her raven black hair flowed behind her as she flew through the air with an air of grace and elegance. She had a slender figure with a stunningly cold beauty that could freeze anyone in their tracks. Her eyes were the color of ice, and they seemed to pierce through Azazel's very soul. Rowena wore armor forged with a metal that looked like ice. It shimmered in the eerie glow of the snowfall, and Azazel could see his reflection on the polished surface. The armor was intricately designed, with snowflakes and ice crystals etched into the metal. The intricate designs carved into it were reminiscent of frozen snowflakes, giving it an ethereal and otherworldly appearance. The armor had a sleek, form-fitting design that accentuated her slender figure and moved with her fluidly. The breastplate had a high collar that covered the base of her neck, giving her an air of regal authority. The pauldrons were elongated and curved, tapering to sharp points that looked like they could easily slice through metal. They extended down her arms, protecting her biceps and forearms, and ended in sharp spikes that pointed toward her enemies. Her gauntlets were adorned with icy blue gems that shimmered in the light, giving her attacks an added elemental power. The boots were made of a lighter material, allowing for easy movement and agility, but still protected her shins and calves. As she drew closer, Rowena's eyes locked onto Azazel's, and she stopped in midair. Her expression was unreadable, and Azazel couldn't tell if she was there to help him or to kill him. He prepared himself for the worst, his demonic aura burning hot against the coldness of her presence. In her hands, Rowena wielded 2 long chains with blades attached to them. The blades were imbued with a frigid chill that caused everything they touched to freeze. The weapon was unlike anything Azazel had ever seen before, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of apprehension as Rowena approached him. Her appearance was both beautiful and deadly, befitting her position as the Holy Maiden. Their eyes locked in a tense stare down, both of them sizing each other up. Azazel could feel Rowena's power emanating from her very being, and he knew that he was in for a tough fight. Rowena watched the war around her with an icy gaze, her expression stoic and unreadable. Despite the chaos and destruction, she remained calm and collected, as if observing a mere game of chess. She had always been a woman of few words, and her silence only added to the tension and mystery around her. "You've caused enough chaos, demon," Rowena said, her voice carrying a steely edge. "It's time for you to stop. I don't recall taking orders from you, Holy Maiden. Your brother's filthy pet has spilled the blood of someone we held dear. So, neither the Dark Queen nor I will leave this place without spilling some monkey blood." Chapter 9:26, Returning the Favor. The Holy Maiden's eyes blazed with righteous fury as she confronted Azazel, the demon who threatened the very fabric of their realm. "Your bloodlust will consume whatever humanity you have left inside. You threaten this very realm by existing. I will stop you before you destroy us all," she declared, her voice ringing out like a battle cry. But Azazel only laughed, his demonic grin sending chills down her spine. "You fools are only making things worse for yourselves," he sneered. "If the Dark Queen breaks through the barrier and reaches that monkey, lives will be spared. But by delaying her, you are making way for the Dark Lord. And when he arrives, the sea around us will turn crimson with the blood of your people." The tension in the air was palpable as the 2 adversaries stood facing each other. The Holy Maiden's slender form was clad in icy armor that seemed to shimmer with an otherworldly power, while Azazel's dark wings spread wide as he towered over her. The wind howled around them, carrying the faint scent of blood and burning ash from the ongoing war. The sky above was a deep crimson, stained by the blood of fallen warriors. As the energy barrier flickered and lost its glow, the tension between Rowena and Azazel intensified. The cracks in the barrier grew wider, and the undead outside clawed with renewed vigor. The vampires cheered and roared, emboldened by the sight of the weakened barrier. The Nagaland soldiers and guardians scrambled, unsure of what to do next. But Rowena had only one thing on her mind, her little brother Noah, who was inside the castle. With a determined look on her face, she tightened her grip on her blades and dashed toward Azazel. The sound of her armor clanking and blades slicing through the air echoed in the chaos around them. Azazel smirked, unfazed by Rowena's charge. He lifted his hand, and a group of undead soldiers rushed toward her. Rowena swung her blades in a wide arc, sending a wave of ice and snow toward the undead. They froze solid, their bodies shattering into a million pieces as they hit the ground. She didn't stop there. Rowena leaped over the frozen corpses and charged at Azazel, her blades glowing with a cold blue light. Azazel summoned a bolt of dark energy and fired it at her, but she deftly dodged it and sliced through it with her blades. Their blades clashed, sparks flying as they exchanged blows. Rowena's icy blades glinted in the dim light while Azazel wielded a scimitar in his hand, snatched from a fallen guardian, but it was far from his weapon of choice. Their weapons clashed again and again, each strike echoing like thunder in the chaos around them. As they fought, the cracks in the barrier grew wider, and the undead army poured through them. Rowena's attention was torn between defending the castle and fighting Azazel. But she knew she had to keep him at bay, at least until her brother was safe. With a fierce determination, Rowena continued to fight, each strike of her blade sending waves of cold and ice toward Azazel. The battlefield was chaotic and bloody, but Rowena remained focused, her eyes fixed on Azazel, the man who threatened her brother and her world. Rowena's weapons were an extension of her will, and as she charged toward the undead and Azazel, she swung her blades with a fluid and graceful motion. The blades were attached to long chains, allowing Rowena to throw them, impale her foes, and yank them back toward her. The holy maiden moved with a deadly grace, her movements precise and calculated. With each swing of her blades, she took down multiple undead, her chains allowing her to strike from a distance and keep the enemy at bay. The blades were imbued with a chilling cold that froze the undead in their tracks, shattering them into pieces. Eggless novel COM. As she approached Azazel, Rowena's blades were a blur, slicing through the air with a deafening whistle. Azazel dodged and weaved, but Rowena's attacks were relentless, and he found himself on the defensive. The chains attached to Rowena's blades were like extensions of her body, allowing her to twist and turn in ways that were impossible for a normal human. She threw the blades towards Azazel, yanking them back towards her at the last moment, making it difficult for him to predict her movements. In the heat of the battle, Rowena's armor began to glow with a bright blue light, and her eyes flickered like sapphires. Her movements became faster and more fluid, and her attacks became more precise and deadly. Azazel fought with all his might, but he could not match the holy maiden's skill and power. With a final swing of her blades, Rowena sent Azazel flying, his body crashing into the ground with a loud thud. Despite being a stage below Azazel's cultivation level, Rowena's fighting style was a perfect match for the demon's reckless approach. She used the chains attached to her blades with such expertise that it seemed like they were an extension of her own arms. With one fluid motion, she threw her blades, impaling the undead and yanking them toward her, all while dodging Azazel's powerful strikes. Her armor glinted in the sunlight as she spun around, her blades whistling through the air. Azazel's brute strength and lack of technique proved to be his downfall. Every time he swung his scimitar, Rowena would dodge and strike back with a flurry of blows, leaving cuts and bruises all over his body. But the demon's regeneration powers were astonishing, his wounds healed almost instantly, and he continued to laugh maniacally with every blow he received. When Azazel hit the ground, he immediately rose back to his feet, his wounds healing at an incredible speed. Instead of groaning in pain, he laughed maniacally and thumped his own chest as if reveling in the pain. Then, he dashed into the air, meeting Rowena's blades head-on once again. The two combatants were evenly matched, each landing blows on the other with impressive speed and precision. The undead began to crawl through the weakened barrier, adding to the chaos of the battle. But Rowena remained focused, her eyes fixed on Azazel as she danced around him with her blades. Azazel's scimitar clashed against Rowena's blades, sending sparks flying. But Rowena was not deterred, using the chains on her weapons to entangle Azazel's sword and disarm him. With a swift motion, she brought her blades down, striking Azazel with a lethal blow. But to her surprise, he merely laughed once again, the wound on his body already beginning to close up. As the fight continued, Rowena started to channel her magic into her blades, infusing them with the power of ice. With a flick of her wrist, she sent the icy blades hurtling toward Azazel. He managed to dodge them, but not without difficulty. The spells were grand and one of a kind, each one more powerful than the last. Azazel charged at Rowena, but she was ready for him. She yanked on the chains attached to her blades, pulling them towards her and impaling Azazel's arm. He grunted in pain and tried to pull away, but Rowena yanked on the chains again, causing him to stumble towards her. She took advantage of his momentary weakness and delivered a swift kick to his stomach, sending him flying backward. As Azazel rose to his feet, Rowena began to chant a new spell, her eyes glowing with power. Suddenly, the air around them grew colder, and a thick layer of ice started to form on the ground. Azazel's eyes widened in surprise as he realized what was happening. But before he could react, Rowena unleashed a powerful blast of icy energy toward him, encasing him in a thick block of ice. However, Azazel was not defeated yet. With a fierce growl, he broke free from the icy prison, shattering it into a million pieces. He lunged towards Rowena once again, but this time she was ready. With a swift movement, she sliced her blades through the air, creating a powerful gust of icy wind that knocked Azazel off his feet and sent him flying backward. The fight continued, each combatant giving it their all. But it was clear that Rowena had the upper hand, her ice spells proving too much for Azazel to handle. As the battle between Rowena and Azazel reached its peak, the sky above them started to darken. Azazel's eyes gleamed with a fiery intensity as he began to channel his power, his body radiating a menacing aura. Rowena tensed, her grip on her weapons tightening as she watched Azazel with wary eyes. Suddenly, the air crackled with electricity as Azazel unleashed a powerful bolt of lightning that streaked toward Rowena. She swiftly evaded the attack, spinning in mid-air and launching a barrage of ice spears at Azazel, who countered with a blast of wind that shattered the spears into 1,000 shards. The two combatants circled each other warily, each waiting for the other to make a move. Then, with a fierce roar, Azazel summoned a massive ring of crimson-red flames that blazed with an infernal heat. The heat was so intense that Rowena could feel it even from her position in the sky. Rowena gritted her teeth, calling forth all her strength and knowledge to counter Azazel's spell. She conjured a blizzard that raged across the sky, driving back the flames and engulfing Azazel in a tempest of ice and snow. The two opposing elements clashed violently, each trying to gain the upper hand. The battle raged on, with both combatants unleashing spell after spell in a furious display of power. The sky above them was a chaotic dance of ice and fire, with the two opposing forces battling for dominance. As the battle reached its climax, the sky above them exploded in a dazzling display of light and sound, sending shockwaves through the air and shaking the very ground beneath them. Suddenly, Azazel's muscles bulged as he summoned all his strength, ready to overpower Rowena. With a guttural growl, he charged at her and swung his scimitar with all his might. Rowena barely managed to block the attack with her chained blades, but the force of the blow sent her flying backward. As Rowena staggered to regain her balance, Azazel took advantage of the opportunity and lunged forward, delivering a powerful punch straight to her chest. The impact was so strong that it dented her icy armor and sent her crashing down to the ground. Rowena grunted in pain as she spat out a small amount of blood from her mouth. She struggled to get back up, but Azazel was relentless. He continued to attack her with a flurry of punches and kicks, each one stronger than the last. Azazel grinned, bloodlust in his eyes as he looked at Rowena. "You may have some tricks up your sleeve, but in the end, brute strength will always triumph," he said, before unleashing a powerful blow with his scimitar that dented Rowena's armor and made her stagger back. "You may be strong, demon, but you lack finesse and technique. It will be your downfall," Rowena replied coldly, her lips curling in a sneer. Azazel just laughed at her words, his eyes glinting with dark amusement. "Finesse and technique are overrated. Brute strength and raw power are all that matter in the end. Just look at the undead crawling through the barrier. It's only a matter of time before they reach that precious castle," he taunted, snickering as he watched Rowena's face contort with anger. "Your arrogance will be your downfall, Azazel," Rowena hissed before launching into another round of spells and attacks. Gaia and Zanala's battle was just as intense as Rowena and Azazel's. The two Nagas clashed their weapons, causing shockwaves that shook the earth and created fissures in the ground. Meanwhile, the Nagaland soldiers were locked in combat with the Dark Lord's army. Despite being outnumbered, the Nagaland soldiers were able to hold their ground thanks to their king Castiel joining the battle. The sight of their king fighting alongside them gave them a much-needed morale boost, and they fought with renewed determination. However, their morale began to waver as they saw the undead break through the barrier around the castle. The soldiers could see the horde of undead crawling through the cracks in the barrier, and they knew that it was only a matter of time before the undead reached the castle. Fear and desperation spread among the soldiers as they realized their fight may have been for naught. As the undead successfully crawled through the castle barrier, Gaia felt a surge of adrenaline rush through her veins. With fierce determination, she launched herself at Sonali, relentlessly attacking her with swift punches and kicks. Sonali, despite her armor, was starting to feel the toll of the long battle, and her movements became increasingly sluggish and sloppy. Gaia's years of intense training and real battle experience allowed her to move with deadly grace and power. She began to land a barrage of punches and kicks, each one hitting with bone-shattering force. With a final flourish, Gaia fired an arrow that hit Sonali's sword, knocking it out of her hand and leaving her completely vulnerable. With a powerful strike to Sonali's chest, Gaia sent her sister hurtling to the ground, crashing onto a pile of rubble. Gaia wiped the trickle of blood from her mouth and cracked her neck, determined to finish the fight. But when Castiel saw Sonali's vulnerable state, he sprinted towards her, throwing himself in front of her to shield her from Gaia's wrath. The battle between Gaia and Castiel was now set to begin, but for a moment, both sides paused, locked in a tense stare-down. Gaia came to an abrupt stop, and the sound of her footsteps echoed in the silence. She landed on the ground with a thud as Sonali struggled to pick herself up, coughing up blood. Castiel's voice cut through the silence like a knife. "Gaia, stop this madness. She is your sister." Gaia's expression turned cold, and she slowly turned to face Castiel. "Sorry to burst your bubble, but she is not my sister. And you were never my father." She spat out the words, slowly and menacingly walking towards Castiel. Gaia's eyes narrowed as she slowly approached Castiel. "It's a mystery to me how you can expect me to listen to you after all you've done," she snarled. "Let me remind you of your sins. You ignored me after my mother's death, married another woman, and gave her all your love, driving our kingdom into debt. You chose Sonali as queen instead of me, the rightful heir. You broke my meridians with your own hands, threw me into a dungeon, and left me to die. Do you honestly expect me to forgive and forget after everything you've done?" Castiel stepped forward, holding his hands up in a defensive manner. "Gaia, I know I have wronged you in many ways, but please, hear me out. The circumstances were not in my control. I had to make difficult choices for the sake of the kingdom." As he spoke, Gaia's eyes narrowed, and her grip on the sword tightened. She failed to notice a strange, split-second glow in Castiel's eyes, which quickly disappeared. "You talk about difficult choices," Gaia spat, "but you never chose me. You never gave me a chance. You let me suffer and rot in that dungeon. And now, you expect me to forgive you. To trust you." Castiel's eyes softened as he took a step forward. "Please, Gaia, you are my daughter. My blood. And I love you." But Gaia shook her head and stepped back. "You are not my father, Castiel. I mean, you are literally not my father." Castiel's eyes flickered once again, but Gaia was too caught up in her rage to notice. Gaia's voice echoed through the ruined buildings as she snickered, "You never batted an eye when you broke my meridians. Now let's see if you react the same when I break hers." Castiel stood in shock, unable to comprehend the gravity of Gaia's words, as she effortlessly sent him flying with a punch to his face. Sonali trembled in fear at the sound of Gaia's words and began to crawl backward, trying to distance herself. But Gaia was swift, and in a matter of seconds, she had grabbed Sonali by the neck and lifted her from the rubble. Gaia's grip on Xenala's neck tightened, cutting off her air supply. The younger sister gasped and struggled for breath as Gaia lifted her off the ground effortlessly. Castian's eyes widened in horror, and for a split second, they glowed white. "Please, Gaia, don't do this," Xenali pleaded weakly. Her body was trembling with fear and pain, and her voice was barely above a whisper. Ignoring Xenala's plea, Gaia tightened her grip even more, causing Xenali to choke and wheeze. "I warned you not to fight me again," Gaia growled, her voice full of malice. "But you never learn, do you?" As Xenala's face turned blue and her struggles weakened, Castian stuttered in horror. "Gaia, stop. What are you doing?" Before Castian could do anything to intervene, Gaia delivered a series of rapid punches to Xenala's stomach, shoulders, and forehead. The sickening sound of bones breaking echoed through the air, and blood sprayed from Xenala's mouth and eyes. Xenala's screams of agony filled the air as her cultivation level plummeted rapidly. Castian shouted helplessly, tears streaming down his face. "No! Xenali! How could you do this, Gaia? You're a monster." The forbidden move taught to Nagas was one of the most gruesome ways to break someone's meridians. It was a vicious attack that could cause irreversible damage to the victim's cultivation level, and it was considered an act of cruelty even in the world of cultivation. The sight of Xenala's broken body and Castian's despair made the soldiers lose all hope. The battlefield had become a living nightmare. Chapter 927, Bloody Sweet Revenge. Castian rushed towards Xenali and knelt beside her unconscious body. Tears streamed down his face as he gently brushed her hair back from her face, his heart heavy with the weight of despair. "My dear Xenali," he sobbed, "how could this happen to you? To us?" Gaia stood over them, her face twisted into a cruel smile as she watched the scene play out. She had achieved her revenge, and it tasted sweet. But Castian's anguished cries pierced through her triumph, and she felt a pang of guilt. Castian lifted Xenali into his arms and turned to Gaia, his eyes filled with a mix of love and anger. "Eagles Nova 1, oh, how could you do this to your own family?" he shouted, his voice shaking with emotion. "Xenali was only trying to do what was best for the kingdom. And you have destroyed everything." The stormy weather mirrored Castian's turbulent emotions, with thunder and lightning crackling in the distance. But Gaia remained unmoved, her eyes cold and empty. "I asked you the same 3 years ago," she spat, her words like venom. "You chose her over me, always. And now, I've made you feel the same pain that I've felt my whole life." Castian's heart twisted in agony as he held Xenali close, her body limp in his arms. The world around them seemed to fade away as he mourned the loss of his beloved daughter, and the betrayal of his other. "How could I have been so blind?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the raging storm. "How could I have let this happen?" Castian's eyes blazed with fury as Gaia's words hit him like a knife in the gut. He cradled Xenala's limp form protectively, glaring up at Gaia. "You are no daughter of mine. You are a devil, heartless and cruel. How could I have ever loved you?" Castian spat out the words like poison, his voice hoarse with rage. Gaia's face twisted with anger at his words. "I am what you made me, father. You always favored Xenali over me, even when I was the rightful heir. You never cared for me, only for your precious Xenali." Castian's anger boiled over, and he cursed and spat out vile words at Gaia. "I wish I had killed you instead of breaking your meridians. You are a curse upon this world, just as Selassie warned me." The stormy weather matched Castian's tumultuous emotions, lightning illuminating the sky and thunder shaking the earth. Xenali lay still in Castian's arms, her fate uncertain, as the 2 remaining members of the royal family stood facing each other in the midst of chaos and destruction. As the news reporters watched the scene unfold before them, they couldn't help but feel a sense of horror and disbelief. They had heard of Gaia's reputation as a ruthless warrior, but seeing her break her own sister's meridians with such ease was truly chilling. The memories of Castiel breaking Gaia's meridians 3 years ago came flooding back, and it was clear that Gaia had not forgotten that betrayal. The reporters couldn't help but draw parallels between the two incidents, and it was clear that Gaia was now seeking revenge on her own family. As they watched Gaia's cold and heartless demeanor, the reporters couldn't help but feel a sense of fear and unease. This was not the actions of a hero, but of a villain. Gaia had earned her title as the Dark Queen, and it was clear that she would stop at nothing to achieve her goals. The reporters knew that they had to be careful when reporting on Gaia's actions, as they didn't want to become her next targets. But they also knew that the world needed to know about the danger that the Dark Queen posed. They could only hope that someone would be brave enough to stand up to her and put an end to her reign of terror. As they watched Gaia break Zanala's meridians, the reporters were horrified by the ruthless display of power. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," one whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. "This is beyond cruel. Remember when Castiel broke Gaia's meridians 3 years ago?" Another chimed in. "It's like she's returning the favor, but 10 times worse." "I always knew there was something off about her," a third added, shaking her head. "Celicy was right all along. Gaia is pure evil." As the scene played out, the reporters couldn't help but feel a sense of fear and dread. This was not a woman to be trifled with, and they knew that the title of Dark Queen was well deserved. "She's unstoppable," one muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. "What hope do we have against her?" "None," another replied grimly. Some of the news reporters began to speculate about the Dark Lord's whereabouts. They whispered amongst themselves, wondering if he was lurking in the shadows, waiting to make his grand entrance. "If the Dark Queen is this ruthless without the Dark Lord by her side, imagine how much worse things could get," one reporter muttered. Another chimed in, "We haven't seen the last of him. He's out there somewhere, pulling the strings from behind the scenes." They all looked around nervously, fearing the worst. The thought of the Dark Lord's arrival sent shivers down their spines. Castiel's heart sank as he looked at his daughter's unconscious form. His sorrow quickly turned to anger, and in a fit of rage, he ordered his soldiers to slaughter Gaia. "Kill her," he screamed, tears still streaming down his face. "Kill that heartless devil." Some of the royal guards hesitated at the order, unsure if they could carry out such a brutal act against the princess. But as Castiel continued to shout and cry, the guards finally made their move, dashing towards Gaia with their weapons drawn. Gaia, however, was not caught off guard. She had been trained to be a warrior since birth, and her skills were unmatched. In a blur of movement, she easily dodged the guards' attacks and countered them with brutal precision. Her sword sliced through the air, tearing flesh and bone alike. Blood spattered everywhere as the guards fell one by one, their bodies mutilated by Gaia's deadly strikes. Castiel watched in horror as the once loyal soldiers were torn apart before his eyes, their lifeless bodies hitting the ground with a sickening thud. As Gaia approached Castiel, his face was splattered with the blood of his own men. He could barely look at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sadness. But Gaia showed no remorse. Her eyes burned with fierce determination as she approached her father. "Is this what you want?" she spat, her voice filled with venom. "More bloodshed. More death." Castiel could only stare at her in shock, unable to find the words to respond. The scene around them was utter devastation, and he knew there was no going back from this. Gaia snickered, wiping the blood of her sword with a piece of cloth as Castiel looked at her with a mixture of anger and fear. "You see, Castiel, there is no one in this kingdom who can stop me," she said, her voice filled with arrogance. "And Zanala's fate. That's your fault. You should never have listened to that old hag Celicy and that weakling Zanali. You should have grown a spine like a king should." Castiel's face contorted with rage as he lunged at Gaia, but she sidestepped him easily and brought her sword down on his shoulder, slicing through the armor and drawing blood. You will pay for what you've done, he growled, clenching his teeth against the pain. Gaia chuckled, twirling her sword in her hand. Oh, I already have, Castian. Revenge is sweet, isn't it? Castian's anger reached a boiling point as he saw the cold, cruel smile on Gaia's face. In that moment, his eyes briefly glowed white, but the light quickly faded. Without hesitation, he charged at Gaia with Zanala's sword tightly clenched in his hand. Gaia dodged Castian's sword strikes with ease, dancing around him effortlessly like a leaf in the wind. Castian was screaming and roaring like a wild beast in anger, driven by the fury of his loss and the injustice of Gaia's actions. You heartless devil, he shouted, lunging at her once more. You'll pay for what you've done. But Gaia was too quick for him. She sidestepped his attack and delivered a swift kick to the back of his knee, sending him crashing to the ground. Castian gritted his teeth and tried to get up, but Gaia was already on top of him, pressing her boot down on his chest. You're nothing but a pathetic, weak king, she sneered down at him, her voice dripping with contempt. And now, you'll pay the price for your incompetence. Castian struggled to free himself from Gaia's grip, but it was no use. She was too strong for him. He kept trying to strike her with his sword, but each blow was effortlessly parried by Gaia. Is that the best you can do? Gaia taunted, laughing cruelly. You really are a pitiful excuse for a king. Despite his failing strength, Castian continued to fight with all his might, driven by his love for Zanali and his hatred for Gaia. But Gaia was too powerful, too skilled, and too determined to be defeated. With a final, brutal blow, she knocked Castian's sword from his hand and held him at her mercy. Gaia picked up Castian by his neck, lifting him off the ground effortlessly as he clawed and scratched at her with his bare hands. But Gaia simply smirked and swatted his feeble attempts away. You're nothing but a weak, pathetic excuse for a king, she sneered. And now, you're mine to play with. The soldiers of Nagaland looked on in shock and horror as they watched Gaia, the once beloved princess of their kingdom, holding their king by the neck and beating him mercilessly. They hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but then one by one, they began to step forward, drawing their weapons. But Gaia simply laughed and tossed Castian aside like a rag doll, her eyes flashing with a cold, ruthless determination. Come and get me, if you dare, she taunted, her voice echoing across the battlefield. With a sudden, swift movement, Gaia drew the sword from her hip and held it in her free hand. She raised the blade high, ready to strike down upon Castian. But before she could, the soldiers found their courage and rushed forward, intent on stopping Gaia. Gaia was too quick for them, her movements fluid and precise. With one hand holding Castian's neck and the other wielding her sword, she effortlessly struck down the soldiers one by one, their bodies falling lifelessly to the ground. And through it all, Castian remained in her grasp, his struggles growing weaker and weaker with each passing moment. Gaia smiled cruelly as she watched him, knowing that she had finally achieved her revenge. Gaia slowly pushed her sword through Castian's heart, her eyes cold and unfeeling. Castian gasped for breath, his eyes widening in shock and pain. He reached up to Gaia's face, trying to claw at her with his fingers, but she easily batted his hand away. As Castian's life slowly slipped away, he glared up at Gaia with pure hatred in his eyes. I curse you. Gaia, you heartless devil, he stuttered, his voice weak and rasping. The soldiers and news reporters watched in horror, unable to comprehend the brutality before them. Some of the soldiers hesitated, unsure of what to do, while others tried to rush forward to stop Gaia, only to be cut down by her sword. The news reporters hovered in the distance, shivering, capturing the scene with recording crystal for all the world to see. Their faces were a mix of shock and disbelief as they watched Gaia kill the man who was once their king. How could she do this? One reporter muttered under her breath, tears streaming down her face. How could anyone be so heartless? Another reporter shook his head in disbelief. "This is a dark day for Nagaland," he said. As Gaia slowly pulled her sword out of Castian's lifeless body, the sky rumbled with thunder, and lightning flashed across the darkened sky. The soldiers stood in stunned silence, their faces etched with horror and disbelief. Gaia turned to face them, a cold smile on her lips. "Don't look so surprised," she said. "You knew this was coming." The soldiers and news reporters remained silent, too afraid to speak. They had never seen such ruthless and brutal behavior before and feared what Gaia was capable of. Gaia turned her attention to Zenali, who still lay unconscious on the ground. "I could have killed her too," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "But I want Salisi to see her daughter suffer every time she lays eyes on her. Death would have been a mercy for Zenali. And for Salisi, well, this is just the beginning." The soldiers and news reporters watched in horror as Gaia walked away, her eyes filled with cold, empty hatred. They knew that there was no stopping her now, that she was capable of anything. And as they looked down at Castian's lifeless body, they knew that their kingdom would never be the same again. Zenali was still alive, but her meridians had been shattered beyond repair. Except for the Dark Lord, no one could heal her, and Gaia saw Zenali as a tool that she could use in the future if needed. And so, she left her lying there, broken and powerless, a constant reminder of her own cruelty and ruthlessness. Chapter 928, Secret is Out. Diana Winston was standing in the dimly lit room, her gaze fixed on the window. The room was adorned with elegant tapestries and furnishings, but all of it seemed insignificant in the face of the impending doom that was creeping closer. On the bed, Noah lay motionless, dressed in pristine white. Sabrina sat beside him, her eyes glued to his face as she brushed his hair back with a trembling hand. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash that echoed throughout the castle, followed by an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. Diana's eyes narrowed as she stepped towards the window, drawing the heavy curtains aside to reveal the chaos outside. The sight that greeted her was a nightmare that come to life. Undead and vampires were swarming over the castle walls, fighting against the Nagaland soldiers and guardians who were trying desperately to fend them off. And amidst it all, the Dark Queen herself was leading the charge, a vicious gleam in her eye as she cut down anyone who dared to stand in her way. Sabrina's voice trembled as she spoke up, "Mother, what's happening?" "They've broken through the barrier," Diana replied, her voice cold and devoid of fear. Sabrina was horrified as she rushed to the window to witness the terror unfolding outside. "We have to do something," she pleaded. Diana turned to face her daughter, her eyes flashing with anger. "What do you propose we do?" "Apologize for Norvin killing her beloved dragon." Sabrina winced at the bitterness in her mother's tone. "Maybe if I talk to her, I can dash," Diana cut her off with a sharp shake of her head. "You think she'll listen to reason? All they ever did was save us, time and time again. And what did we do in return? We killed one of them." Her words hung heavily in the air, and Sabrina could sense the fear and regret that lay beneath the icy exterior her mother presented. Despite her tough demeanor, Diana was worried about what would happen if the Dark Lord arrived. As if on cue, a flash of lightning illuminated the sky, and the ground shook beneath their feet. The undead were getting closer by the second, and there was nothing they could do to stop them. Sabrina felt helpless, and she knew that her mother felt the same. Diana was fed up with the constant manipulation of Noah by the Sky Hall, Andreas, and the Guardians. Even though Norvin had sworn that he killed Nightmare, Diana had a nagging feeling that there was more to the story than he let on. Despite her outwardly cold and angry demeanor towards Sabrina, Diana was secretly terrified. She couldn't shake off the fear of what would happen when the Dark Lord, the son that no one knew she had, finally arrived. Diana's eyes flickered with determination as she surveyed the chaos unfolding outside. "We can't stay here for long," she said firmly, her voice laced with urgency. Sabrina's face lit up with hope. "If we could get to the rooftop, we can reach Rowena's floating palace and teleport to the Sky Hall, she suggested. At the mention of the Sky Hall, Diana's eyes blazed with anger. The Sky Hall had been the root of all their troubles, causing endless strife and conflict within their family. Noah and Ghost had been at each other's throats, unaware that they were brothers, all because of the machinations of the Sky Hall. Diana's fists clenched at the thought, and a fierce determination burned within her. She wouldn't let the Sky Hall control their lives any longer. Diana's heart sank as she looked out at the horde of undead and vampires surging toward the castle. She knew that their only hope of escape was to reach the rooftop and teleport to the safety of Rowena's floating palace. But the thought of bringing Noah to the steps of the Sky Hall, the place where so much pain and manipulation had originated, filled her with a sense of dread. Eggless novel C.O.M. She glanced out the window once more, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the approaching army. She knew that she had one more card to play, but she was hesitant to reveal her true identity as Harriet Hunt. As much as she wanted to protect her family from the Sky Hall, she also knew that they needed all the help they could get. But if she revealed herself, everything would change. The world as they knew it would be turned upside down. Diana clenched her fists, feeling torn between her duty to protect her family and her desire to keep her true identity a secret. But she knew that time was running out, and they had to act fast if they wanted to survive the coming battle. As much as Diana hated bringing Noah to the steps of Sky Hall, she knew she had no other choice. Deep inside, Diana felt that all the efforts she had put into protecting her family and keeping them away from the Sky Hall were starting to crumble. The thought of her sons fighting against each other filled her with dread, and she would rather die than watch them kill each other. But right now, her priority was to save her beloved son Noah. However, as she looked at the overwhelming number of undead and vampires swarming towards the castle, she knew that reaching the rooftop without a fight was impossible. Sabrina was a skilled fighter, but the sheer number of enemies would be too much for her to handle. With no other options left, Diana knew she had to reveal her true identity as Harriet Hunt. Despite her desire to keep her past hidden from her family, she realized that her son's safety was the top priority. Sabrina, who had always been fascinated with Harriet Hunt's story, would surely recognize her mother. After all, Sabrina had read every book and note on Harriet Hunt that she could find. But Diana feared that Sabrina would be devastated to learn that her mother had lived a lie for decades, pretending to be someone else. It was a risk she had to take, but Diana couldn't help feeling apprehensive about the consequences of her revelation. Sabrina's heart was racing with fear as she watched the undead horde rushing towards the castle. She knew she had to protect her brother and mother at all costs. As she looked at her mother, she saw the determination on her face, and it gave her some hope. But she could see the fear in her mother's eyes, which made Sabrina feel even more anxious. Sabrina had always seen her mother as a gentle and fragile woman who had never experienced violence or harm. She had been sheltered from the outside world and had always relied on her family to keep her safe. But now, with the undead and vampires closing in, Sabrina knew that it was her duty to protect her family and keep them safe. Although she knew that Diana was strong and capable, she couldn't imagine her delicate mother fighting against the undead and vampires. Sabrina felt a sense of duty to protect her brother and mother, to keep them safe from harm. But deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change and that their lives would never be the same again. With a determined look in her eyes, Sabrina stepped forward and flicked her wrist, summoning a long, silver sword into her hand. The blade gleamed in the dim light of the room, and Sabrina's grip on the hilt was firm and steady. "Mother, take Noah with you and stay close," she instructed, her voice strong and resolute. Sabrina's words had barely left her lips when a loud banging on the door interrupted them. Diana's heart skipped a beat as she realized that the undead had breached the castle walls and was now at their door. Ethan was away from the castle, which calmed Diana a bit, knowing that he was with the other Winstons and could protect her children if needed. But deep down, she knew that he would be desperate to return and fight by her side. A deafening thud echoed through the room as the door suddenly buckled under an unseen force, sending shivers down Sabrina's spine. The sound of clawing and growling grew louder by the second, causing Sabrina to stand in front of her mother, her grip tightening around the hilt of her sword. Diana felt her heart racing as her mind conjured images of the undead horde breaking through the door and spilling into the room like a raging flood. Then, the door finally cracked open, revealing the 5 undead that had managed to slip past the guards and make their way into the castle. These were not your average undead, as they were thin and quick, their movements resembling that of an animal more than a human. Their glowing red eyes locked onto Sabrina and Diana. Sabrina, however, was quick to react, her sword gleaming in the dim light of the room as she rushed toward the undead with fierce determination. The clash of metal against flesh filled the room as Sabrina expertly dispatched the undead with deadly precision, each swing of her sword sending sparks flying. Sabrina finally dispatched the 5 undead who rushed into the room, leaving blood and gore scattered around the space. The silence that followed Sabrina's victory over the undead was deafening. The only sounds that could be heard were the faint rustling of the wind outside and the soft panting of Sabrina as she regained her breath. The room was filled with the stench of blood and gore, and Sabrina's silver sword glinted in the dim light. Diana's eyes scanned the room, her senses heightened as she waited for the next wave of attack. She could feel the tension in the air, as if the silence was just a prelude to a much bigger threat. Suddenly, the shadows outside the room started to move. Diana, a seasoned warrior, knew this silence just symbolized a bigger threat. The shadows at the doorway started to take shape as a figure robed in black robes emerged. The figure's body was almost completely concealed by the long, dark cloak that flowed behind it, and the only visible features were the sharp, gleaming fangs poking out from under the blood-soaked fabric. The air around them seemed to grow colder as if the very presence of the figure was sapping the warmth from the room. Diana could sense that this was no ordinary vampire. The way it moved, with a slow and deliberate pace, made it clear that this was a creature of great power and malice. As the vampire made his way into the room, his presence alone sent chills down Sabrina's spine. His black robes flowed around him as he moved, and his fangs glistened in the dim light. Sabrina could feel his malice radiating off of him, making her feel as if she was in the presence of death itself. "I found Noah," the vampire crackled, his voice laced with bone-chilling malice. The way he said it made Sabrina's blood run cold. The vampire took slow, deliberate steps toward Sabrina and Diana, and Sabrina could see the delight in his eyes at finding them. But despite her fear, Sabrina stood firm, her sword tightly clenched in her hand. She knew she had to protect her mother and brother at all costs. "Jackpot," the vampire kept chuckling in a low, sinister voice. His chuckle sent shivers down Sabrina's spine. In his eyes, Sabrina was weak, a mere core-strengthening stage warrior, and Diana was even weaker, only at the body-refining stage. He usually wouldn't even bother to waste his time drinking her blood. However, this time was different. This weak and powerless woman was Noah's mother, and that made her valuable to the vampire. He hoped to capture them and offer them as a reward to the Dark Queen. Sabrina lunged at the vampire with her sword, but the vampire didn't take her seriously. He dodged with ease and taunted her, "Is this all the strength you have? I thought you were supposed to be protecting your family." His voice was laced with malice and amusement. He continued to dodge and weave around Sabrina's attacks, playing with her like a cat with a mouse. "You're no match for me, little girl. I'm a soul-refining stage vampire, and you're just a core-strengthening warrior. You're like a kitten trying to fight a lion," he said with a smirk. As Sabrina continued to fight, the vampire kept bragging about how he would be rewarded by the Dark Lord when he presented Noah to him. "When I bring Noah to the Dark Lord, he will be pleased and reward me handsomely. And he'll make sure he knows that I also caught his precious mother and sister," he said, his voice filled with pride. He continued to taunt them, "You should come with me instead of waiting for the Dark Queen. She'll kill you in her anger, but I can guarantee your safety." His voice was slick and persuasive, but Sabrina knew better than to trust him. The vampire, who had been toying with Sabrina, suddenly decided he had had enough. He moved with lightning-fast speed and landed a powerful punch on Sabrina's jaw, sending her reeling backwards. Sabrina's sword clattered to the floor as she struggled to stay on her feet. The vampire smirked as he approached Sabrina, who was trying to get back up. "Don't worry, a little taste won't hurt," he taunted, baring his fangs. Sabrina gritted her teeth and lunged at him, but the vampire easily sidestepped her and punched her in the stomach. Sabrina gasped for air and fell to her knees, clutching her stomach. The vampire loomed over her, a sinister smile on his lips. "You're a feisty one," he said. "But it's time to put you out of your misery." He raised his hand to strike the final blow. But before he could do so, he suddenly felt a gush of wind and saw a blur of movement. A split second later, he felt a sharp pain in his neck and saw blood spurting out. He stumbled backward, trying to pull away, but it was too late. He felt his body go limp and he fell to the ground, dead. Sabrina couldn't believe her eyes as she looked up to see her mother standing before her with a sword in her hand. The blood on her face made it difficult to see clearly, but she knew it was her mother. How could she have defeated the powerful vampire who had knocked her out with just one strike? Sabrina's shock was palpable, and her mind was racing with questions. What just happened? How her feeble, weak mother killed the vampire? Sabrina could only stare in disbelief, waiting for her mother to explain what had just happened. The air was tense, and the silence was deafening as the two of them stood there in the aftermath of the battle. The future was uncertain, and Sabrina had no idea what was coming next. Chapter 929, Secret is Out. Sabrina was in a state of shock as she looked up to see her mother standing before her with a sword in her hand. Her mother's appearance was transformed as she stood there, her hair disheveled and her clothes covered in blood. The black blades of the sword glinted in the dim light, and the blood of the vampire trickled down the sword, staining it red. The headless body of the vampire twitched on the ground as Sabrina struggled to take in what had just happened. The room was filled with the metallic smell of blood, the stench of death and decay, and the sickly sweet odor of the vampire's flesh. Sabrina could hardly believe that her mother, the gentlewoman who had always been her rock, had just slain a powerful vampire with ease. The image of her mother, standing there like a warrior, her sword dripping with blood, was seared into Sabrina's mind. The shock of the moment left Sabrina trembling and unable to speak. She didn't know what to do or what to say. All she could do was stare at her mother, trying to reconcile the woman she knew with the fearless warrior who stood before her. As Sabrina looked at her mother holding the blood-stained sword, she couldn't help but feel a sense of shock and disbelief. Her mother, who she always thought of as gentle and sweet, seemed like a completely different person at that moment. It was almost as if she had been transformed into a fierce warrior, ready to do whatever it took to protect her family. But Sabrina couldn't forget the memories of her mother's gentleness, the moments when she tucked her into bed at night and read her bedtime stories. Or the times when they baked cookies together and laughed as they made a mess in the kitchen. She remembered the time when she was 7 and had a nightmare. Her mother stayed up with her all night, holding her until she fell asleep. And the time when she tried to fly on top of a sword and fell down, her mother stayed with her and cleaned her wounds while singing her favorite song. These memories flooded Sabrina's mind, making her feel like she was in a dream. She couldn't reconcile the sweet memories with the fierce warrior standing before her, holding a sword drenched in blood. It was like seeing two completely different sides of her mother. As Sabrina continued to stare in shock, the room smelled of blood, and the twitching of the vampire's headless body on the ground created an eerie atmosphere. But Sabrina's mind was too preoccupied with the image of her mother as a fierce warrior, the one who just saved her life, and the one who she could always trust to keep their family safe no matter what. Unbeknownst to Sabrina, Ethan had revealed Diana's true identity as Harriet Hunt to her almost a year ago when she had returned from the southern continent after being kidnapped by the vampires. But Samuel had erased those memories from her mind. And when Imelda had accidentally spilled the truth again, Samuel had wiped her memories once more. However, this time, Sabrina was left without Samuel to erase her memories again. When the room fell silent, Sabrina stared at her mother in shock. She had never seen this side of her before. The black sword in her hand seemed like an extension of her arm, dripping with the blood of the fallen vampire. The scent of death and decay lingered in the air, mixing with the metallic smell of blood. "Take your brother and stay close to me," Diana commanded Sabrina, but Sabrina was too stunned to follow her mother's orders. Before Sabrina could process what was happening, another group of undead and a vampire barged into the room. The mindless undead rushed into the room with no awareness of what had happened, but the vampire leading them was taken aback by the sight before him. The vampire's eyes widened in shock at the sight of his comrade's decapitated head. Sabrina tried to gather herself and reach for her sword but was too slow. In a split second, Diana lunged at the group, the black sword gleaming in the dim light of the room. The vampire and undead were caught off guard by Diana's sudden attack, but they quickly recovered and started to fight back. Sabrina watched in awe as her mother fought with the agility and strength of a seasoned warrior. But the odds were against her, and she was outnumbered. Sabrina tried to gather her wits and reach for her sword, but the shock and the sight of her mother in battle made her movements slow and clumsy. She saw her mother surrounded by the undead and the vampire, her black sword moving with blinding speed. Sabrina could hear the clash of swords and the growls of the undead, but it all seemed distant, like a dream. As Diana lunged forward with her black sword, she moved with such grace and precision that it seemed almost supernatural. Her movements were swift and deadly as she sliced through the undead with ease. Her blade glinted in the flickering light of the torches as she moved, leaving a trail of blood and gore in her wake. Eggless novel COM. The vampire was caught off guard by Diana's sudden attack, and for a moment, he hesitated. But Diana showed no mercy, and she charged forward with a fierce determination. The vampire tried to dodge her attacks, but Diana was too quick for him. With a deft swing of her sword, she sliced through the vampire's neck, decapitating him in one swift motion. The vampire's headless body collapsed to the ground with a sickening thud, and blood gushed from the wound in a grotesque fountain. The undead, confused and disoriented by the sudden attack, stumbled about blindly, but Diana was relentless. She sliced through them with ease, each swing of her sword sending limbs and torsos flying through the air. As the last of the undead fell to the ground, Diana stood in the middle of the carnage, her black sword dripping with blood. Sabrina watched in shock, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had never seen her mother like this, and the sight was both terrifying and exhilarating. In that moment, Diana seemed like a different person altogether. Her eyes burned with a fierce intensity, and her face was twisted into a grimace of determination. She was like a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding. For a moment, there was silence in the room, broken only by the sound of Sabrina's ragged breathing. Then, slowly, Diana turned to face her daughter. The black blade of her sword gleamed in the flickering light, and Sabrina couldn't help but feel a shiver run down her spine. "Get your brother," Diana's voice boomed through the room like a fierce storm that made Sabrina's bones shiver. It was a far cry from the gentle and soothing voice Sabrina was used to hearing. Without wasting any time, Sabrina rushed to Noah and cast a simple spell, causing an invisible hand to lift him into the air, close to her gently. "Mother," as they stepped outside the door, Sabrina tried to question Diana, but her mother was already charging forward, her sword gleaming under the dim light. Sabrina followed behind her, her mind racing with questions. What was happening? Why was her mother wielding a black sword? And who was she really? After exiting the room, Sabrina and Diana found themselves in a narrow hallway that smelled of damp stone and musty air. The hallway was dimly lit, and the walls were lined with torches, casting a flickering orange light. The floor was made of worn stone bricks that were uneven and slippery. The hallway led to a narrow staircase that wound its way up to the rooftop of the castle. As they walked, they could hear the sound of shuffling footsteps coming from the other end of the hallway. Sabrina could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she realized that the undead horde and vampires were on the other side of the hallway and walking toward them. But Diana stood between Sabrina and the undead with her sword in her hand, ready to fight. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Sabrina could hear the hiss of vampires as they approached. The flickering torches cast ominous shadows on the walls, making it difficult to see what was coming. Sabrina tried to calm herself down, but she couldn't help feeling a surge of fear as the footsteps grew closer. Diana's grip on her sword tightened as the undead and vampires approached. Sabrina could see the determination in her mother's eyes as she stood her ground. Despite the overwhelming odds, Diana remained calm and composed. The undead and vampires were almost upon them now, their moans and hisses growing louder with each passing moment. Sabrina's heart was pounding in her chest as she trailed behind her mother, her mind racing with questions about Diana's true identity. But before she could even voice them, Diana turned to her with a steely gaze and issued a chilling command. "Stay behind me, and don't try to be a hero," she said in a cold, commanding tone. The horde of undead and vampires rushed toward them, their growls echoing through the narrow hallway. Sabrina could feel the ground shaking beneath her feet as they drew closer. To her shock, her mother's hair color began to change before her eyes, transforming from golden to raven black. Her gentle mother was no longer recognizable as she stood tall and fierce, her white robes now replaced with black armor. A long black coat draped over her armor, making her appear even more intimidating. Sabrina couldn't believe her eyes as she watched her mother transform into a warrior right before her very eyes. Sabrina couldn't believe her eyes. Her mother, who she had always known as a gentle and nurturing figure, now stood before her in a black armor and raven black hair, resembling the famous Harriet Hunt. It was a shock that left Sabrina stunned and unable to comprehend what was happening. Despite the striking resemblance to the legendary Harriet Hunt, Sabrina couldn't bring herself to believe that her mother was Harriet Hunt. The shock of seeing her mother in such a different light was overwhelming, and Sabrina could feel her thoughts swirling in confusion. As Harriet dashed towards the horde of undead and vampires, her swords glinted in the dim light of the hallway. The undead and vampires rushed at her, snarling and hissing, their teeth and claws bared. Harriet met them head-on, swinging her sword with deadly precision, cutting down the undead and vampires one by one. The smell of blood filled the air as she waded through the horde, her black armor and long black coat swishing behind her. The fight continued as Sabrina watched in awe as her mother fought with unmatched skill and agility. Suddenly, another black sword appeared in Harriet's hand, and Sabrina realized her mother was dual-wielding her swords. The clash of steel against steel echoed through the hallway as Harriet parried the attacks of the undead and vampires, striking back with deadly accuracy. Blood spattered the walls and floor as Harriet's sword sliced through flesh and bone. The undead and vampires were relentless, but Harriet was a force to be reckoned with. Sabrina could see the resemblance between her mother and Harriet Hunt, the famous vampire hunter, and it shocked her to the core. She couldn't believe that her own mother had such a dark and dangerous past. Despite the overwhelming odds, Harriet fought on, her swords a blur of motion as she cut through the horde of undead and vampires. Sabrina watched in horror as her mother took hit after hit, but Harriet never faltered. She fought with a determination and ferocity that Sabrina had never seen before, and it filled her with both awe and fear. As Diana fought the horde of vampires and undead, she took several hits from their sharp claws and teeth. Blood trickled down her face, and her armor was covered in gore, but she refused to back off. Her sword flashed through the air as she took down vampire after vampire, her movements fluid and precise. Despite the brutal hits she took, Diana kept fighting with all her strength. The vampires were fast and agile, but she was even faster. She dodged their attacks with ease and countered with deadly precision, slashing through their flesh and severing limbs. The undead were slower, but their sheer numbers were overwhelming. Diana fought them off with her swords, striking them down one by one. But as the fight continued, Diana began to tire. Her movements slowed, and she started to take more hits. Despite the pain, she refused to give up. She fought on, her swords dancing in the air as she battled the horde with everything she had. Diana felt the pain of every hit from the vampires and the undead. But instead of retreating, she roared like a lioness and fought back even harder. Her black swords glimmered in the dimly lit hallway as she struck the undead and vampires with deadly precision. She kept fighting, her eyes burning with a fierce determination to protect her family. As more and more undead and vampires came at her, Diana's movements became more fluid, and her strikes more deadly. She moved like a whirlwind, her swords cutting through the air and slicing through the undead and vampires. Through the chaos of battle, Sabrina watched in awe as her mother fought with such ferocity and skill. Regardless of the odds stacked against her, Diana never gave up. She was a true warrior, a hero in the face of danger. Sabrina's heart leapt in her throat as she saw the vampire knock one of the swords from her mother's hand. "Mother, watch out!" Sabrina shouted, fear and urgency lacing her voice. But Diana was already one step ahead. With lightning-fast reflexes, she dodged the vampire's next attack, twirling her remaining sword in her hand. And then, to Sabrina's amazement, Diana raised her free hand and a blinding white flame burst forth from her fingertips. The flame was pure and bright, so bright that Sabrina had to shield her eyes from the intensity of the light. The flame shot forth like a laser beam, burning a hole through multiple undead and vampires in its path. Sabrina watched in awe as her mother wielded this incredible power, her raven-black hair whipping around her face as she fought on with renewed vigor. As the fight continued and Diana proved her incredible fighting skills, Sabrina's mind struggled to process the reality of the situation. Despite her attempts to convince herself that her mother was not Harriet Hunt, the evidence in front of her was overwhelming. The black swords, the black armor, the stunning combat skills, and the power of the white flames all pointed to one undeniable truth: her mother was indeed the legendary Harriet Hunt. Sabrina felt a mix of emotions, including shock, disbelief, and confusion. She had always known her mother as a gentle and caring woman, not a fierce warrior capable of taking on hordes of undead and vampires. It was difficult for Sabrina to reconcile the two images of her mother in her mind. As she watched her mother continue to fight, Sabrina's thoughts raced. What did this mean for their family? How had her mother been able to keep her true identity hidden for so long? And most importantly, what was going to happen next? Michael will appear in 2 chapters and it will be worth the wait. Chapter 930 The Dark Lord's Wrath. Harriet was a force to be reckoned with. Sabrina watched in awe as her mother slaughtered wave after wave of undead and vampires. She could see the fatigue in Harriet's movements, but it didn't stop her from taking down any enemy that dared to get close. Sabrina could feel the terror in her heart as she saw the number of undead and vampires that had amassed outside the castle. She knew that they were outnumbered and outmatched, but her mother's strength gave her hope. As the battle continued, Sabrina saw Harriet take hit after hit, but she kept fighting. Blood dripped from cuts and bruises on her body, but she refused to back down. Sabrina watched as her mother fought with fierce determination, her eyes blazing with a fire that seemed to come from deep within her soul. It was clear that she was fighting for her family, for her children, and for the safety of her loved ones. Sabrina's heart swelled with pride and admiration for her mother, but at the same time, she felt a deep sense of fear. She didn't want to lose her mother to this battle, but she knew that the only way to survive was to keep fighting. Diana wielded her black swords with the precision of a seasoned warrior and used the white flames to aid her in the battle. The flames illuminated the hallway with a blinding light as they burned through the flesh of the undead and vampires. The stench of burnt flesh and blood filled the air as Harriet cut through the horde of monsters with ease. The hallway was now a gory mess with body parts and blood splattered everywhere. Sabrina walked behind Harriet in shock, trying her best not to step on any of the corpses. She was afraid of the power and brutality of her mother. Sabrina never imagined that her gentle mother could fight with such ferocity. Harriet was still taking hits from the vampires and undead, but she never faltered. She moved like a whirlwind, spinning and cutting her way through the horde of monsters. The vampires and undead kept coming, but Harriet didn't back down. The battle raged on, and it seemed like it would never end. But with every swing of her swords and every blast of her white flames, Harriet was getting closer and closer to the rooftop where they could escape. As they reached the stairs that led to the rooftop, Diana could see the shadows of vampires and undead climbing up the circular stairs from below. She quickly turned to Sabrina and Noah. "Sabrina, take Noah and walk in front of me. Climb the stairs to the rooftop. I will take care of them from behind," Diana ordered in a commanding voice. Sabrina hesitated for a moment, looking at her mother's battered and bloodied state. But Diana gave her a reassuring nod, and Sabrina gathered her wits and took Noah's hand. As they started climbing the stairs, Sabrina could hear the screeching and growling of the undead behind them. She could feel her heart racing as she climbed higher and higher with Noah floating before her. The stairs were narrow and winding, making it difficult for them to climb quickly. But Sabrina could see the rooftop getting closer with each step they took. As they climbed the stairs, the vampires and undead climbed up from below. Diana had to fight while climbing the stairs and using the environment to her advantage. She kicked an undead down the stairs, causing a chain reaction that took out a few more. She spun around and sliced a vampire's head off, causing blood to splatter on the walls. Sabrina walked fast, keeping her brother close and casting spells to weaken the undead. But Diana was the one doing most of the fighting. She used her sword to parry blows and struck back with deadly precision. The stairs became slick with blood and gore as the bodies piled up. One vampire managed to grab Diana's leg, but she kicked him off and then smashed his head with the hilt of her sword. Sabrina felt fear creeping up her spine, but she knew she had to keep moving. She climbed up the stairs as fast as she could while Diana fought off the attackers. The vampires and undead climbed up the stairs as they taunted Diana with their hissing voices. "You think you can escape us, bitch?" a vampire sneered as he lunged at her. But Diana was quick and agile, dodging his attack and striking him down with her sword. She didn't respond to the vampire's words, knowing that words wouldn't save her or her family. Another vampire tried to grab her from behind, but Diana spun around and sliced his head off with a swift stroke of her sword. However, she didn't escape unscathed. One of the undead managed to land a blow on her shoulder, causing her to grit her teeth in pain. But she didn't let it stop her from fighting, using the environment to her advantage by kicking a nearby stone down the stairs, causing the undead to trip and fall. As they climbed higher and higher, the battle became more intense, and the vampires became more desperate to stop Diana. But she fought on, striking down any who came close to her, even as more wounds appeared on her body. "You can't run," another vampire snarled. But Diana just glared at him with fierce determination in her eyes. "Come and get me," she replied as she delivered the final blow that sent the vampire tumbling down the stairs. The vampires couldn't believe their eyes as they saw Diana, a seemingly fragile and weak human, taking down their brethren with ease. They exchanged glances of confusion and disbelief. "Is she really human?" one vampire asked another. "She can't be," another replied. "No human could fight like that." Diana heard their whispers and couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. She knew that her true identity as Harriet Hunt was still a secret, and the vampires had no idea what they were up against. She continued fighting with determination and strength, taking hits and inflicting wounds upon the undead and vampires. Despite the pain and exhaustion, she refused to give up, knowing that the safety of her family depended on her. With each swing of her sword, she proved to the vampires that she was not to be underestimated. And with each vampire she took down, she drew closer to the rooftop and the safety it offered. When they reached the rooftop, Sabrina was awestruck by the view of the ongoing war. She saw the undead and vampires on one side, fighting against the Guardians and Nagaland soldiers on the other. There were no dragons in sight, but the battle was intense nonetheless. On the ground, Guardians and Nagaland soldiers fought bravely against the overwhelming horde of undead and vampires, with swords and spells, trying to hold their ground. The sky was filled with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. Sabrina could hear the sound of clashing swords and the screams of the dying. Her heart raced as she watched the battle from above, feeling helpless and scared. Sabrina's heart lifted as she saw the flying palace hovering above them. She could barely contain her relief as she pointed up at the massive structure, shouting to Diana. "Mother, there's the palace," she cried out, her voice filled with hope. Diana looked up and saw the palace as well. A look of relief washed over her face as she realized that they were almost safe for a moment. The sky was a chaotic dance of ice and fire as Rowena and Azazel continued their battle. Their spells clashed with thunderous booms, sending shockwaves through the air and rattling the ground below. Despite the danger, Azazel's maniacal laughter echoed across the sky, a testament to his insane thirst for power. Diana's heart raced as she watched the battle unfold. She wanted nothing more than to join in and help her daughter, but she knew that Noah's safety had to come first. The stakes were too high, and she couldn't afford to lose focus. As she turned to Sabrina, she could see the fear in her eyes. Sabrina's hands trembled, and she struggled to catch her breath. Diana knew that she had to remain calm and steady, even in the face of such chaos. She put a reassuring hand on Sabrina's shoulder and whispered, "Stay close to me. We'll get through this." But even as she spoke, her attention remained fixed on the battle raging above. The sky was filled with crackling energy and dazzling displays of light, and Diana could feel the raw power emanating from Rowena and Azazel. It was a deadly dance, and Diana knew that only one would emerge victorious. As the battle continued, Diana's anxiety grew. She couldn't bear the thought of losing her daughter, not after everything they had been through. Her heart clenched with each blast of energy and every spell that echoed through the sky. Rowena had been fighting Azazel for what felt like an eternity, the sky above them exploding with magic and chaos. She had summoned all her strength and knowledge to counter Azazel's spells, her icy blades whistling through the air as she danced around him. Finally, with a deadly punch, Rowena sent Azazel flying backward and she flew back to the castle, landing on the rooftop. But when she saw the blood-drenched sight of her mother, Rowena's heart skipped a beat. Despite her cold personality and character, Diana, as a mother, could see the worry in Rowena's eyes. Trembling with concern, Rowena approached Diana, her mind filled with questions. She wanted to know if her mother was all right if she had been hurt in the battle. The sight of her mother, covered in blood, filled her with a sense of dread and unease. Diana, sensing her daughter's worry and confusion, pulled her into a tight embrace, holding her close. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a silent embrace, the chaos of the battle still raging around them. Finally, Diana pulled back, looking at Rowena with a solemn expression. "I am fine, my dear," she said, her voice steady and reassuring. "But we need to focus on the task at hand. We need to ensure Noah's safety and get through this." Rowena nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. She knew her mother was right. They couldn't afford to let their emotions cloud their judgment, not when the fate of Noah was at stake. Together, they turned to face the chaos below, ready to do whatever it takes to protect Noah. As Rowena led Diana, Sabrina, and Noah toward her flying palace, the sky above them crackled with energy. Suddenly, a deafening boom echoed through the air, and a blinding light filled the sky. When the light faded, a group of soldiers descended from the heavens, their armor glinting in the sunlight. They wore silver plate armor and had blue feathery metal wings attached to their backs. Lightning flashed around them, and the ground shook as they landed on the rooftop. Rowena tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for her blades. But the soldiers made no move to attack. Instead, they stood in formation, their eyes fixed on Rowena and her group. Diana's eyes flared up in anger as she saw the Angels of Sky Hall unit descend from the sky. Her heart felt like it was about to burst with a powerful emotion that she couldn't quite put into words. Their mere presence made her blood boil with a fierce intensity. The sight of the Angels of Sky Hall unit triggered a deep-seated anger within Diana, one that had been smoldering for over 25 years. She had once led a unit of angels and trained them, only for them to turn on her when she was at her most vulnerable, about to give birth to her children, Noah and Dean. The betrayal still burned like a fiery inferno within her, a constant reminder of the pain and suffering she had endured. As she gazed upon the angels before her, Diana's eyes blazed with a fiery intensity, the anger inside her threatening to boil over. It took all of her willpower to keep her rage in check, to prevent herself from lashing out at these new soldiers who had done her no harm. But the memories of the past were too fresh in her mind, the wounds too deep to ignore. She could feel the anger burning hotter and brighter with every passing moment, threatening to consume her completely. Diana knew that the angels before her were not the same ones who had betrayed her so many years ago, but the anger inside her was like a beast that could not be tamed. It clawed at her from within, demanding to be unleashed. Yet, somehow, she managed to keep a tight rein on her emotions, her iron will preventing her from acting on her impulses. It was a struggle, a battle that raged within her, but she refused to let her anger get the better of her. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Diana took a deep breath and managed to regain her composure. The anger inside her still burned, but it was a controlled burn now, one that she could manage. She knew that she had to keep her emotions in check if she wanted to protect her family. Rowena's heart raced as she watched the exchange between the angels and her mother. "Escort them to my palace," she ordered, trying to maintain a calm exterior despite her growing fear. "They are coming with us, holy maiden," the man in armor replied, his voice cold and unyielding. Rowena's frown deepened. "They are going to my palace." "It's an order," she repeated, her tone now icy. "We have our own orders, holy maiden." "Your mother and brother are coming with us to the Sky Hall," the angel said, his voice devoid of any emotion. Diana's eyes narrowed as she realized the implications of the angel's words. She had taken an oath never to use her light flames or wield a sword again, and now it seemed the Sky Hall had discovered her secret. Sabrina's heart pounded in her chest as the tension in the air thickened. "Rowena, please, we have to go," she pleaded. But Rowena's attention was fixed on the angels, her grip on her blade tightening. "What is the meaning of this?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the silence. The lead angel remained stoic, his armor gleaming in the moonlight. "We have our orders, holy maiden," he repeated. Diana stepped forward, her eyes narrowed with anger. "What orders? Who sent you?" The angel's gaze flickered to her for a moment before returning to Rowena. "We are to bring you and your family to the Sky Hall," he stated plainly. Rowena's eyes blazed with icy fury. "And if I refuse?" she challenged, her blade now pointed at the lead angel. Rho Alpha D Alpha, N Nu E, CM. The air crackled with tension as the angel remained unmoved. "We have been given authority to use force if necessary," he warned. Sabrina's hand trembled as she clung to Noah's arm. She could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on them all. Diana's mind raced with thoughts and emotions as she stared at the impassive angels before her. The weight of the decision she had to make felt like a crushing burden on her heart. She hated the idea of being under the control of the Sky Hall again, but the safety of her family was at stake. Her hands trembled as she clasped them tightly, trying to hide her fear and anger. She knew that if she refused to go with the angels, the consequences would be dire. She could not risk the lives of her loved ones for her own pride and anger. Taking a deep breath, Diana made the difficult decision. She would go with the angels to the Sky Hall, no matter how much she despised it. She would do whatever it takes to keep her family safe, even if it meant giving up her own freedom. "Rowena!" Sabrina's voice quivered as she spoke up, trying to catch the attention of the two powerful women. At first, they ignored her, lost in their own thoughts and concerns. But when Sabrina called out once more, pointing towards the distant sky, their hearts began to race with fear. Despite the already dark storm clouds above, the sky Sabrina was indicating was completely black, as if it was swallowing up everything in its path. The darkness was slowly but surely moving towards them, causing a chill to run down their spines. Chapter 931 The Dark Lord's Wrath. The black clouds spread across the sky like a menacing blanket, blotting out the sun and casting the entire kingdom into darkness. The air grew thick and heavy, and the winds picked up, howling like a pack of wolves. The storm grew increasingly violent, lightning bolts streaking across the sky like jagged scars, and thunder shaking the very foundations of the castle. But the sudden darkness that enveloped the kingdom was different. It was not just the absence of light, but a palpable, suffocating darkness that seemed to smother everything in its path. Even the brightest lights flickered and dimmed, unable to penetrate the darkness. It felt like the end of the world had come, and the kingdom was about to be swallowed by the void. As the darkness descended upon the kingdom, the vampires could feel the energy of the Dark Lord within it. They became excited and elated, seeing it as a sign of his arrival. The darkness was a manifestation of his power, and it made them feel stronger, more alive. They could sense the fear and panic in the humans, but to them, it was a source of amusement. They laughed and cheered, eagerly awaiting the arrival of their master. The vampires were confident that with the Dark Lord by their side, they would be unstoppable. As the darkness enveloped the kingdom, a sudden shift in the air could be felt. It was as if the very atmosphere was charged with an eerie energy. The temperature dropped drastically, and the wind picked up, whistling through the trees and buildings. The sky was no longer just dark, it was now a deep, almost malevolent black. As the seconds ticked by, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The hair on the back of the neck stood up, and the silence was deafening. It was then that the ground began to tremble, and a distant rumble could be heard. The tremors increased in intensity, and the very foundations of the buildings shook. Suddenly, there was a flash of blinding light, and a deafening boom echoed across the land. The source of the light and sound was unclear, but it was as if the heavens themselves were being torn asunder. The air crackled with energy, and the darkness seemed to swirl and pulse, as if alive. The vampires felt a renewed sense of excitement and anticipation at the dramatic change in the atmosphere. They knew that something significant was happening, and the thought of the Dark Lord's arrival only made them feel stronger and more powerful. The anticipation and excitement among the vampire community were palpable as they eagerly awaited what was to come. The Dark Queen and Azazel floated up into the sky, their forms silhouetted against the darkness that had enveloped the kingdom. They hovered there, suspended in the air, their eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the darkness seemed to be coming from. As they waited, the wind picked up, blowing their hair and clothes wildly around them. The clouds churned above them, lightning flashing and thunder rumbling ominously. The air was thick with the scent of magic, dark and powerful. Gaia and Michael shared a deep affection for their loyal dragon, Nightmare. Gaia was in Nagaland on a mission to avenge Nightmare's death by killing Norvin, who she believed was responsible. However, despite her fearsome reputation, the thought of facing Michael's wrath over Nightmare's death stirred unfamiliar emotions in her heart. Gaia knew that Michael's love for Nightmare was as deep as hers, if not deeper. She tried to push aside her worries and focus on the task at hand, but the uncertainty gnawed at her, making her feel vulnerable and exposed. Diana felt like her heart was being torn apart as she watched the impending doom that was about to befall her family. She knew that the Dark Lord was her son, and the fact that he was coming to kill his own twin brother, Noah, was unbearable. She felt a mix of fear, guilt, and sorrow all at once. As a mother, Diana had always wanted the best for her children, but she never imagined that they would end up as enemies, fighting against each other in a battle of good versus evil. She wanted to reach out to her son and tell him the truth, but she knew that it was too late. The Dark Lord was already on his way, and there was nothing she could do to stop him. Diana felt helpless and torn between her loyalty to her family and her obligation to keep the truth from her children. She knew that she had to face the Dark Lord and stop him from killing his family. But at the same time, she couldn't bear the thought of fighting against her own flesh and blood. It was a heart-wrenching situation that left her feeling conflicted and emotionally drained. The reporters and cultivators who were watching the darkness from a distance huddled together, shivering with fear. "Did you feel that?" one of the reporters asked as a gust of wind blew through the area, making them all shiver even more. "It's the Dark Lord. He's coming," another replied, his voice trembling. "We have to get out of here," another cultivator said, "before he arrives and kills us all." The cultivators were equally afraid. "We need to leave this place. The Dark Lord's power is too great," one of them said. "Remember what happened to the Thusian army? The Dark Lord slaughtered them all," another added. "We have to get out of here," another cultivator said, "before he arrives and kills us all." The group quickly dispersed, running in different directions, hoping to find a safe place to hide until the Dark Lord's arrival was over. The Guardians and Nagaland soldiers stood at the ready, their weapons gripped tightly in their hands as they waited for the arrival of the Dark Lord. The Guardians' faces were etched with fear and despair as they remembered the last time they faced him. They knew the power that he possessed and the destruction he could cause. "I wish Noah was here with us," one Guardian said, his voice trembling. "He is the only one who can defeat the Dark Lord." "But he is still in a coma," another replied. "We have to do what we can with what we have." The Nagaland soldiers, who had only heard of the Dark Lord's power, looked even more frightened. They huddled together, their eyes darting nervously around as they waited for the inevitable. "I never thought I'd see the day when the Dark Lord would come to Nagaland," one soldier muttered. "I heard he slaughtered an entire army of Thusians by himself." "He's like a demon," another soldier said, his voice shaking. "I don't know how we can fight him." The Guardians tried to hide their own fear, but it was clear that they were also struggling to keep their composure. They knew that their duty was to protect the kingdom, but they also knew that they were facing a nearly impossible task. As Rowena watched the storm grow darker and more violent, she knew that her family needed to be escorted to safety as soon as possible. She turned to the angels who had brought her mother and siblings and commanded them to leave and take her family to a safe location. "You need to get out of here now and take my family with you," Rowena said firmly. The lead angel, who had been so cold and unyielding before, suddenly seemed to grow more arrogant. "We do not take orders from you, Holy Maiden. We have been recently appointed as angels, and we answer only to the Sky Hall, Rho Alpha D Alpha, NUEC, 0M." Rowena was taken aback by the angel's arrogance, but she remained determined. "I don't care who you answer to. My family needs to be protected, and I won't allow them to be caught in the crossfire of the Dark Lord's arrival. You will take them to safety." As the minutes ticked by, the sky above Nagaland grew even darker, as if the blackness had a life of its own and was spreading like a plague. The clouds roiled and churned, flashing with lightning bolts so bright they seemed to split the very air in two. Thunder boomed like the sound of 1,000 cannons, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The wind howled like a pack of wolves, whipping up debris and scattering it through the streets. It was as if the elements themselves were rising up in rebellion against the impending arrival of the Dark Lord. The darkness crept closer as Rowena's floating palace suddenly came to life, unleashing a barrage of fiery energy balls that pulsed with immense power. The Guardians stood in awe as they watched the energy surge through the air, destroying buildings and sending debris flying in all directions. "What in the name of light is happening?" one Guardian exclaimed, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "I don't know, but we have to do something." Another shouted, his eyes fixed on the raging battle in the sky. Each ball of fire was powerful enough to shatter the ground beneath it, and the energy pulsated from the fireballs as they flew toward the darkness. The energy balls continued to surge through the air, each one more powerful than the last. The Guardians could feel the ground beneath them shaking as the energy pulsating through the air, and they knew that they were witnessing a battle unlike any other. As the Guardians watched in awe, a glimmer of hope stirred in their hearts. The mighty palace was unleashing an onslaught of powerful fireballs against the darkness, and they couldn't help but feel a sense of relief at the display of sheer strength. "Maybe we can defeat this darkness after all," one of them muttered, his eyes never leaving the fiery projectiles. Despite the immense power and destruction of the fiery energy balls, the darkness seemed to absorb them effortlessly. As each ball of fire disappeared into the void, the Guardians' hopes began to fade away. They watched in horror as the darkness continued to creep closer and closer, undeterred by Rowena's palace. "No. It's not working," one Guardian murmured, his voice filled with disbelief and dread. "It's too powerful, we're not going to stop it," another said, his voice heavy with resignation. The Guardians felt a sense of hopelessness wash over them as they realized that there was little they could do to stop the impending doom. They watched as the darkness consumed everything in its path, leaving only destruction and chaos in its wake. The storm raged on, the thunder and lightning adding to the chaos and destruction. The Guardians knew that they were witnessing a battle for the ages, one that would determine the fate of their world. Suddenly a pulse of sound erupted from the darkness, even louder than the deafening thunder that had been raging around them. And then, as if in response, a wave of pure blackness shot forth from the heart of the darkness. It seemed to change the very air around them, turning the cold storm into an intense heat that burned their skin. As the wave of darkness approached, they could see that it was not just a wave of energy, but a mass of dark flames that moved like a crescent blade through the air. It felt as though the flames were alive, with a mind of their own. The Guardians and soldiers watched in horror as the wave of darkness consumed the fireballs fired by the floating palace, turning them to ash. And then, with a sound like the hissing of 1,000 serpents, the dark flames washed over the palace itself, melting the mighty structure of cold frost energy into nothingness before their very eyes. The shock of the sudden attack left them all reeling, stunned by the sheer power of the dark flames. For a moment, they could only stand and stare in horror at the empty space where the palace had once stood. But then, slowly, the realization set in that they were in grave danger. The Dark Lord had arrived and made his statement. The sudden destruction of the floating palace left everyone in shock and disbelief. The Guardians stood frozen, unable to comprehend the power that had just been unleashed. The rogue cultivators and reporters on the ground were equally stunned, their jaws dropping in horror. What just happened?" one rogue cultivator stuttered, his eyes wide with fear. That was the Holy Maiden's palace," another exclaimed, pointing up at the now destroyed structure. "I can't believe what I'm seeing," a reporter whispered, his voice trembling. "This is unreal." The power of the dark flames had left them all speechless, unable to process the destruction before them. The Guardians knew that they had to act fast before the darkness reached them, but the shock of seeing the palace destroyed had momentarily paralyzed them. "We have to move," one Guardian shouted, breaking the silence. "The darkness is almost upon us." The group quickly gathered their senses and began to move, running towards the safety of Nagaland's walls. The sound of thunder grew louder as they ran, and the darkness crept closer with each passing second. They knew that they were in for a fight, but they were determined to protect their kingdom at any cost. As everyone's attention was on the destruction of the floating palace, the ground beneath them began to shake violently. Suddenly, one of the Nagaland soldiers let out a deafening scream as his body began to convulse uncontrollably. In the next moment, his body exploded into a mist of blood, bones and flesh. The shockwave from the explosion sent the nearby soldiers flying in all directions, their bodies torn apart by the blast. The Guardians were horrified as they watched their fellow soldiers burst into bloody mist before their eyes. They could hear the screams and cries of their comrades as they too were consumed by the mysterious force. The ground shook with every explosion, sending shockwaves through the air that knocked the Guardians off their feet. Blood and gore filled the air, as the mist of the soldiers' remains covered the ground like a thick red fog. The Guardians frantically tried to protect themselves from the explosions, but it was no use. As the darkness approached them, the soldiers and Guardians continued to burst into a completely red mist. Chapter 932, The Secret That Could Tear Them Apart. As the red mist cleared, the battlefield was a gruesome sight to behold. The ground was stained red with blood, and body parts were scattered everywhere. The air was filled with the stench of death and burning flesh. The surviving Guardians and soldiers were in a state of shock, unable to comprehend what had just happened. They looked around, trying to make sense of the carnage that had taken place. The storm continued to rage on, and the darkness that had enveloped the battlefield made it almost impossible to see. The only light came from the occasional flashes of lightning that illuminated the sky, revealing glimpses of the destruction and chaos that surrounded them. The wind howled through the ruins of buildings and the debris that littered the ground, making it difficult to hear anything but the roar of the storm. It was a disorienting and terrifying experience with no end in sight. The darkness seemed to press in on them from all sides, making it hard to breathe and adding to the overwhelming sense of fear and dread. The once bustling city was now a desolate wasteland. The buildings were destroyed, and the streets were empty except for the piles of rubble and debris. The storm still raged on, but the thunder was muffled as if it was mourning the loss of the fallen soldiers. The sky was still pitch black, and the darkness seemed to have consumed everything. The Guardians and soldiers looked at each other, their faces a mix of horror and disbelief. They knew they had just witnessed something beyond their understanding, something they would never forget for the rest of their lives. As everyone's eyes were fixed on the pitch-black sky, the black clouds loomed closer and closer. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the darkness and slowly descended toward them. The flashes of lightning illuminated his figure, revealing the ominous presence of the Dark Lord. His form was engulfed in a shroud of darkness. The billowing black coat he wore whipped around him in the violent wind, and the two swords on his back were fashioned in the shape of a menacing X. The Dark Lord's eyes glowed with a devilish light, a menacing blend of red and black that sent shivers down the spines of those who dared to look directly into them. His arrival stunned everyone into silence, and as they sensed his cultivation level, their hearts began to race with fear. He was at the half-celestial level, and the power that radiated from him was suffocating. The darkness that enveloped him seemed to spread and expand, leaving the battlefield in even deeper darkness. The Guardians and Nagaland soldiers could feel the weight of his presence, and the atmosphere around them became heavy and tense. The storm that had been raging seemed to quieten down in comparison to the arrival of the Dark Lord. His presence was overwhelming, and it was as if he was challenging anyone to dare to oppose him. As the Dark Lord descended, the very air around him seemed to change. Even the vampires and the undead fell to their knees in fear, paying their respects to his overwhelming power. His gaze was fixed solely on the castle's rooftop, and he floated towards it with menacing grace. The angels surrounding the group felt the pressure building around them, suffocating them with his dark aura. "We are not prepared for this battle," the leader of the angels muttered. His voice was devoid of any emotion. He quickly retrieved a golden scroll from his space ring, attempting to teleport away to safety. But before he could even activate the spell, an invisible force snatched the scroll from his grasp, rendering him helpless. While Rowena watched the Dark Lord approach, she felt his power radiating off him like an all-consuming force. She couldn't even bring herself to move, as though she was frozen in place by the weight of his aura. Despite her own power, she knew that she was weak before him. But even as fear and awe took hold of her, she was filled with a fierce determination to protect her family. When the angels attempted to retreat, a shroud of darkness descended upon each of them, wrapping around their bodies like a twisted embrace. They were pulled towards the Dark Lord. His eyes fixed on them without uttering a single word. Each of the angels struggled and screamed as the darkness ripped them apart, their bodies torn into pieces. Blood splattered everywhere as their cries echoed across the battlefield. Sabrina watched in horror as the Dark Lord showed no mercy, his power overwhelming even the strongest of angels. She trembled as the sound of bones snapping and flesh tearing filled the air, unable to look away from the gruesome scene before her. The darkness seemed to consume everything in its path, leaving nothing but destruction and death in its wake. Finally, the screams subsided, and the darkness dissipated, leaving behind nothing but the remains of the angels. Sabrina felt sick to her stomach, unable to comprehend the ruthless power of the Dark Lord. She knew they were all in grave danger and needed to find a way to survive the coming onslaught. The darkness consumed the angels' bodies and armor and disintegrated into nothingness as the dark flames engulfed them in midair. Not even a speck of ash was left behind as the intense heat of the flames radiated to the ground, filling the air with the smell of burning flesh. Witnessing the ruthless power of the Dark Lord, the Guardians, and Nagaland soldiers could feel their stomachs churning at the gruesome sight before them. The onlookers stood in stunned silence as they watched the Dark Lord unleash his unparalleled power. The destruction of the Holy Maiden's floating palace, the bloody explosions of the Nagaland soldiers and guardians, and the disintegration of a group of half-immortals were all carried out with ruthless efficiency, without the utterance of a single word. Even the Dark Queen and Azazel, who had witnessed their fair share of bloodshed, felt a tinge of fear in their hearts as they watched the carnage unfold before them. Yet, the Dark Queen knew that this was the inevitable consequence of Norvin's killing of Nightmare, and the Dark Lord's wrath was merely a manifestation of that event. As the Dark Lord's gaze turned towards them, Diana felt a surge of fear run through her. Her heart raced as she realized that her son, Noah, was in a coma and unable to defend himself against the half-celestial's power. She knew that no one else there knew the truth of the Dark Lord's identity, and the thought of Noah being caught in the middle of this battle terrified her. The Dark Lord descended toward the rooftop where Supreme Guardian Noah was floating, with Rowena shielding her family and taking slow steps back. The atmosphere was tense as the remaining Guardians, in an act of loyalty towards their beloved Supreme Guardian, turned their cannons towards the Dark Lord. The sense of determination was palpable as they prepared to do everything in their power to keep the Dark Lord away from Noah. Suddenly, hundreds of cannons fired at the same time, sending cannonballs soaring through the sky toward the Dark Lord. However, the Dark Lord calmly raised his finger, and with a flick of his wrist, hundreds of black lightning bolts descended from the dark clouds, striking down the cannonballs mid-air. The lightning bolts continued to strike the airships, causing them to explode in a shower of sparks and debris. The sheer power and precision of the Dark Lord's attack left everyone stunned and shocked. When the Dark Lord turned his gaze toward Noah's family, his eyes glowed with a fierce intensity. The black and red hues emanating from his eyes made it clear that he was consumed with rage. Rowena, shielding her family with her body, spoke his name softly, Ghost. Her voice trembled with fear, the first time anyone had heard such uncertainty in her voice. It was understandable, given the overwhelming odds they were facing. The Dark Lord was furious, consumed by the loss of his beloved Nightmare. Rowena knew that she had to try and reason with him. "Don't do this," she pleaded, hoping that she could somehow appeal to his humanity. The Dark Lord remained silent, consumed by his rage and grief. Memories of the baby dragon perched on his shoulder, its tails coiled around his neck, flooded his mind. The wet licks the dragon had given him, the playful antics they had shared, and the bond they had formed came rushing back, intensifying his emotions. The death of Nightmare had triggered something inside him, a burning desire to avenge his fallen companion. As the memories consumed him, the Dark Lord's eyes flared up, glowing with a dangerous mix of black and red. He raised his hand, and the air around him crackled with dark energy. Rowena, sensing the danger, stepped forward and called out to him, using his name. But the Dark Lord was not in the mood for talking or listening to pleas. The thought of slaughtering every single guardian and everyone Noah held dear consumed him, fueling his anger and determination. Rowena bravely stepped forward, hoping to appeal to the Dark Lord's sense of reason as he let out a menacing growl that sent chills down everyone's spine. "Go away," he snarled in a voice filled with rage and malice, his words echoing through the darkened sky like thunder. His eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity, and the air around him crackled with dark energy. It was clear that he was not in the mood for mercy or compassion. Despite the overwhelming danger, Rowena stood her ground between the Dark Lord and Noah. She was not going to back down, especially when it came to protecting her family. As the Dark Lord continued to approach, Rowena summoned the Cold Flames, a primordial flame of icy blue that was known for its extreme cold. The air around them immediately dropped in temperature, and the flames crackled with a blue light that illuminated Rowena's determined expression. The cold flames were unlike any other flame in existence, as they were born from the very beginning of the universe. They were said to have the power to freeze anything they touched, even other flames. As Rowena summoned the flames, they erupted around her, swirling and dancing like a blizzard of ice and fire. Diana desperately tried to stop Rowena from fighting her own brother, the Dark Lord. But before she could intervene, Rowena charged at the Dark Lord, her hands ablaze with the icy blue primordial flames. With all her might, Rowena threw a punch at the Dark Lord, but he effortlessly caught her fist in his hand. The cold flames burned brighter, but they were no match for the Dark Lord's dark flames that appeared around his fist, coiling around the cold flames like a snake around its prey. The two flames struggled against each other, but soon the dark flames overwhelmed and devoured the cold flames, leaving Rowena stunned and defenseless. The dark flames around the Dark Lord's fist burned hotter and darker than anything Rowena had ever seen. It was a symbol of his immense power and control over the darkness. Diana watched in horror as her daughter was overpowered by her own son, unable to do anything to stop the impending doom that was about to befall them. The Dark Lord's eyes glinted with darkness as he pulled Rowena towards him, holding her by the neck. "Stop!" Diana's voice echoed through the air, but it was too late. The Dark Lord's fist collided with Rowena's stomach, shattering her armor into pieces. She was thrown backward with immense force, crashing through the rooftop and leaving a trail of debris in her wake. The impact was so great that the ground shook beneath them, and a shockwave rippled through the air. The Guardians and Nagaland soldiers watched in horror as Rowena's body slammed into the ground, unmoving. As Rowena crashed through the rooftop, Sabrina's heart sank with fear. She ran towards her sister, screaming her name as she knelt beside her. "Rowena!" Sabrina shouted, tears streaming down her face. Rowena coughed up blood as she struggled to sit up, but her body failed her. Sabrina sobbed in pain and despair as she saw her sister's condition. She knew how strong Rowena was, and seeing her like this was heartbreaking. She wept uncontrollably as she watched her sister slip away, feeling completely helpless in the face of the Dark Lord's power. Diana felt every fiber in her body ache with the urge to rush to Rowena's side, but she knew she couldn't leave Noah alone. She was the only thing standing between the Dark Lord and Noah. She gritted her teeth and remained where she was, her eyes locked on the Dark Lord's menacing figure. The sight of Rowena being sent flying through the air filled her with a sense of helplessness and despair. She had already lost one son and would not lose another one. Diana's heart shattered into a million pieces as she watched the Dark Lord, her own flesh and blood, stand before his twin brother with the intention to take his life. The pain of seeing her own son filled with such rage and hatred was unbearable. It was a pain that only a mother could understand. As Diana stood there, she couldn't help but feel helpless and lost. No one knew the truth that the Dark Lord and Noah were brothers, not even the brothers themselves. It was a secret that Diana had kept hidden for so long, a secret that was now tearing her apart. She was torn between her love for both of her sons, and the duty she had to protect Noah. Diana could feel the weight of the world on her shoulders as she stood between her two sons, one consumed by darkness and the other floating in a coma. She wished she could tell them the truth, wished she could tell them that they were brothers, but the timing was never right. And now, with the fate of both her sons hanging in the balance, Diana was left with nothing but the crushing pain of a mother torn apart by the love for her two sons. Diana felt torn between her duty as a mother to protect her children and the fear of the consequences that might come with revealing the truth. She knew that the only way to stop the Dark Lord and save Noah possibly was to reveal the truth. However, the thought of tearing apart the fabric of their world and the possible backlash from the other factions was overwhelming, especially the Skyhole. Her heart felt heavy with the weight of her decision, and tears streamed down her face as she watched her two sons face off against each other. She knew that the truth would change everything, but it was the only way to end this violence and the Dark Lord's slaughter possibly. As a mother, it pained her to see her sons fight each other, but she also knew that they were both powerful beings who could not be stopped easily. She had to make a decision that would not only affect her family but the fate of their entire world. Diana's heart was torn between her love for her two sons. She couldn't bear the thought of them fighting each other, especially since they were unaware of their true relationship. She knew that revealing the truth would have severe consequences, but she couldn't let them fight to the death. Diana made up her mind that she would rather face the consequences and die than witness her sons killing each other. The pain in her heart was so great that she was willing to sacrifice herself to save her sons from this terrible fate. In that moment, she realized that her love for her sons was stronger than any fear or consequence. She was willing to risk everything to protect them, even if it meant sacrificing her own life. Dean, listen to me. You and Noah, you're brothers. You're both my sons, Diana said, her voice shaking with emotion. Chapter 9:33, Will Michael forgive his mother? As soon as Michael heard the words, his heart felt like it was being ripped apart. A surge of emotions flooded through him, emotions that he didn't even know existed within him. The world around him seemed to come to a stop as he tried to process the revelation. The anger that had been burning within him slowly began to dissipate, replaced by a torrent of other intense feelings. He stood there, rooted to the spot, unable to move or speak as he grappled with the new information. A deep sadness overtook him as he realized the years he had spent alone, longing for a family. The anger he had felt before dissipated and was replaced with a searing rage as he remembered the feeling of abandonment that he had harbored for so long. The knowledge that his own mother had left him only added fuel to the fire that had been burning inside him for so many years. He wanted to lash out and make her pay for what she had done, but a part of him also felt a sense of relief at finally understanding the source of the pain he had carried for so long. He stood there in silence for a moment, his eyes closed, as he tried to come to terms with the truth that had just been revealed to him. Finally, he opened his eyes and turned to face Diana, his expression a mixture of pain, anger, and longing. While Michael stood there like a statue, his mind was filled with memories of his childhood. He remembered being alone and abandoned as a child, with no one to care for him. He would spend hours sitting alone in the dark, longing for the love and affection of a mother. One particular memory stood out to him, a cold, winter night where he had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. He had been wandering the streets, shivering in the cold, when he stumbled upon a couple huddled together under a blanket. They looked at him with pity in their eyes and offered him a small piece of bread, which he gratefully accepted. But as he turned to walk away, he heard them whispering to each other about the danger of taking in a child like him. Michael felt a lump form in his throat as he remembered the hurt and rejection he felt at that moment. He had never forgotten that feeling, and it had driven him to become stronger and more powerful than anyone else. But despite his strength and his status as the world's #1 hitman, he could never shake off the longing for a mother's love and the sadness of being abandoned as a child. As Michael thought about his past and the revelation of Diana being his mother, his heart filled with anger. He couldn't help but think about all the times he felt abandoned and alone as a child. It was like a cruel joke to him that while he suffered as an orphan, Diana raised Noah with all the love and affection that he never received. He remembered a time when he was just a young orphan boy, cold and alone on the streets. He had begged for food and shelter, but no one had wanted to take him in. Meanwhile, Noah had grown up in the safety and comfort of their mother's home, never having to worry about where his next meal would come from or where he would sleep at night. The memory of that rainy night brought tears to his eyes, and he couldn't help but feel angry at Diana for abandoning him. The sadness and loneliness he felt as a child were now compounded by the realization that his own mother chose to raise his brother with all the love and care he deserved while Michael was left to fend for himself. Little did Michael know that 25 years ago, the Sky Hall elders had performed a forbidden ritual to alter Diana's memory and sever her motherly bond with Michael. They had warned her that one of her twin sons would bring destruction and chaos to the world, but even with this knowledge, Diana couldn't bring herself to abandon her own child. However, the elders had gone to extreme lengths to alter her memories, making her believe that she had abandoned Michael, just as Michael had believed for all these years. A cruel twist of fate left Michael feeling angry and betrayed, knowing that his mother had unknowingly abandoned him. Tears began to roll down both Diana's and Michael's eyes as they let the truth sink in. Diana felt a mix of guilt, regret, and sorrow for the pain and suffering that her son had to go through alone. On the other hand, Michael felt a mix of anger, sadness, and betrayal at the revelation that his own mother had abandoned him. They both felt a deep sense of longing for the time that they lost and could never get back. Diana approached Michael with her hands trembling with emotion. Tears streamed down both of their faces as they faced the truth of their familial connection. The dark shroud around Michael began to fade, revealing a man who had been consumed by anger and pain for so long. From above, Gaia watched in stunned silence as she slowly descended to the rooftop. Her usual fierce expression was replaced with a look of shock as the truth of Michael's past was revealed. Gaia was in disbelief upon learning that Diana Winston was Michael's mother, making the supreme guardian and arch-nemesis, Noah, his twin brother. The revelation left her stunned, and for a moment, she set aside her desire to avenge Nightmare. The gravity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone as they grappled with the enormity of the truth that had been revealed. Michael felt an unfamiliar sensation as his mother wiped away the tear from his face. It was the first time in his life that he felt the touch of his mother. His mind was in complete disarray, unable to process the fact that Diana had been his mother all along. He had always imagined that the day he finally discovered the truth, he would be able to maintain his composure and deal with it rationally. But the reality was far different from what he had anticipated. A tidal wave of emotions overwhelmed him, and he struggled to make sense of them. The anger and bitterness that had been simmering inside him for years threatened to boil over, but at the same time, he felt a deep longing for the love and care of a mother that he had never known. Michael wanted to scream and shout at Diana, to demand answers for why she had abandoned him. But his throat felt tight, and no words came out of his mouth. He felt like a lost child, unsure how to process the overwhelming emotions coursing through his body. The thundering storm and gusting wind seemed to have stopped as soon as Diana revealed to Michael that she was his mother. Everyone around them was stunned, and their eyes were wide with disbelief. They couldn't believe what they were hearing. Sabrina broke the silence and whispered in shock, "What? Noah and Michael are brothers?" The rest of the Guardians and Nagaland soldiers were equally stunned and looked at each other with disbelief. The idea of the Supreme Guardian and the arch-nemesis being twin brothers was beyond their comprehension. One of the Guardians whispered, "Did she just say that she is the Dark Lord's mother?" Another one responded, "And Noah's too. They are twin brothers." The realization hit them hard, and they could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. The fact that the Supreme Guardian and the Dark Lord were related by blood was something they couldn't have imagined in their wildest dreams. Diana's trembling voice rang out in the silence that enveloped them. The storm and the wind seemed to have come to a halt as she uttered the words that shook Michael to his core. Her hands shook as she gently cupped Michael's face, the tears rolling down her face as she looked into his eyes. "You are not Ghost," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. "You are Dean Winston. That was the name I gave you when you were born," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael's eyes widened in shock as he heard the name. He had never heard it before, but it felt like a part of him had been awakened. Diana searched Michael's eyes for any sign of recognition or affection, but all she found was pain and anger. She longed to hear her son call her mother just once, but all she received was a barely audible response. "Say something," she pleaded, desperation seeping into her voice. She needed to know how he felt about the truth she had just revealed. Michael's eyes, usually so full of darkness, now held a mix of emotions that Diana couldn't decipher. His voice was strained and almost inaudible when he finally spoke. "I might be your son," he began, his voice shaking with emotion, "but you are not my mother." The words hit Diana like a punch to the gut. She felt as if the world had just crumbled beneath her feet. All she wanted was to embrace her son and make up for the lost time, but she knew deep down that it was impossible. Michael felt that there was no possible way he could forgive his mother for abandoning him and treating him like he was worthless. Although he understood that she may have had her reasons, the pain he went through was too great to forgive and forget simply. His entire life was filled with suffering and despair, and it was difficult to move past the hurt and betrayal he felt. Furthermore, Michael couldn't believe that he and Noah were brothers. They were completely different people in every way possible. Noah had grown up in a loving family, with everything he could ever want, while Michael had to fight for everything he had. The thought of being related to someone who had lived such an easy life was almost laughable. Despite the intense anger and betrayal he felt, a small part of Michael couldn't help but wonder what his life would have been like if things had been different. If he had grown up with his family, would things have been better? Would he have been able to live a normal life instead of one filled with pain and suffering? These questions lingered in his mind, but they didn't change the reality of his situation. He was still the Dark Lord, and he would still have to face his brother in battle. Michael's eyes shifted towards Noah, who was still unconscious in the air. "Even now, you are standing before me, protecting Noah." "I had no one to protect me," Michael said with a sad, bitter snicker. Sabrina's heart skipped a beat when she heard the revelation that Michael was her brother. It was as if all the pieces of a puzzle had suddenly fallen into place, and the bond she had always felt with Ghost now made perfect sense. She had always felt a strong connection to Ghost, the Dark Lord, and now she knew why. It was because they were siblings, and she had never even suspected it. As the reality of the situation sunk in, Sabrina's mind was flooded with memories of her interactions with Ghost. Every time they had fought, every time they had met, every conversation they had ever had suddenly took on a new meaning. She could not believe that the person she had been fighting against all this time was her own brother. Rowena, who had been punched by Michael, slowly rose back to her feet, her body trembling with shock. She could not believe what she had just heard. Her mother had another son, and he was the Dark Lord who had caused so much destruction and chaos. But as Rowena looked into Michael's eyes, she saw not the infamous Dark Lord but her little brother. Despite his terrifying reputation, she could not help but feel a strong connection to him. Michael's voice trembled with a mixture of anger and sadness as he spoke. "I have my own family now, just as you have built yours. But Noah has taken someone precious from me, and he must pay for what he did. He wanted to fight the Dark Lord, didn't he? Well, he will get his chance, whether I am his brother or not," he said, his gaze fixed on Noah's unconscious body. Diana's heart sank at Michael's words. She knew she had to do something to make things right between her sons, but she didn't know where to start. Sabrina, who had been listening to their conversation, felt a knot form in her stomach. She couldn't believe that Ghost was her brother and the infamous Dark Lord at that. Rowena, on the other hand, saw no Dark Lord in front of her, only her little brother. She wanted to embrace him and tell him everything would be okay, but she knew it wouldn't be that simple. The pain and anger in Michael's voice were palpable, and she knew he wouldn't let go of his grudge against Noah easily. With a swift flick of his wrist, Michael pushed Diana aside and extended his hand toward Noah. The unconscious body of the Supreme Guardian slowly floated towards Michael, and before anyone could react, he grabbed Noah by his neck. The air crackled with tension as every onlooker held their breath, realizing that the fate of the world might rest on this moment. The Guardians, Nagaland soldiers, rogue cultivators, and news reporters watched in disbelief as the one person who could stop the Dark Lord's reign was now in his clutches, powerless and unconscious.